Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Her Second Chance in Texas by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. Connie pressed the iron across the pillowcase with practiced strokes, watching the wrinkles surrender beneath the heated metal. Steam rose in thin wisps, carrying the clean scent of starch and lye soap. The linen was of fine quality, purchased by her mother 2 years ago when the engagement had first been announced. Not romantic, that announcement. Practical. Two families who attended the same church, whose businesses complemented each other, whose children were of suitable age and acceptable temperament. She lifted the iron and examined her work. The fabric lay smooth and white, ready to be folded and added to the chest that sat beneath her bedroom window. 12 pillowcases, 12 hand towels, 6 tablecloths of varying sizes, napkins enough for a dinner party of 8. All the linens a respectable wife would need to establish a respectable home. Robert Smith would arrive in 3 weeks to finalize the arrangements. There would be a modest ceremony at the church, a small reception at her parents' home, and then she would move into the house Robert had inherited from his grandmother. A solid house, her mother often reminded her. Good bones, room enough for children. Connie set the iron on its stand and reached for the next pillowcase. She did not love Robert. She suspected he did not love her either. But love, as her mother frequently explained, was not the foundation of a sensible marriage. Compatibility was. Shared values, similar expectations. Love, if it came at all, grew slowly from the soil of daily life, nurtured by routine and responsibility. She had accepted this wisdom without argument. What would be the point of arguing? The match had been decided when she was 19 and she was 22 now. 3 years of waiting, preparing, and watching other girls marry for passion and sometimes regret it. Robert was steady. Robert was kind enough. Robert would provide. The iron had cooled. Connie carried it to the stove and set it on the hot plate to reheat, then returned to fold the finished pillowcase. Her mother was visiting Mrs. Hartley down the street, discussing the menu for the engagement dinner. Her father was at his shop, selling hardware and farm supplies to men who nodded politely at his daughter when she helped behind the counter. This was her life. It had always been her life, and in 3 weeks it would become her life with Robert instead of her life with her parents, and very little would change except the house she slept in and the name on her letters. She did not resent this. She had been raised to expect exactly this. The knock at the door startled her. Connie wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the parlor, noting the quality of the knock. Firm, official, not the casual rap of a neighbor or the tentative tap of a tradesman. She opened the door to find Reverend Caldwell standing on the porch, his hat in his hands and his face arranged in an expression she had seen before. He had worn it when he came to tell the Petersons that their son had drowned. He had worn it when he informed Widow March that her sister had passed in the night. Connie's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Miss Green," the Reverend said, "may I come in?" She stepped back without speaking, her mind already racing through possibilities. Her father, an accident at the shop, a fall from a ladder, a robbery gone wrong. Her mother, taken ill at Mrs. Hartley's, a sudden collapse. But the Reverend did not mention her parents. He sat in the chair her father used for reading the evening paper, folded his hands over his knees and said, "I'm afraid I bring difficult news about Mr. Robert Smith." The words arrived strangely, as if traveling through deep water. Robert, not her parents. Robert, who was in the next county visiting his uncle's farm. Robert, who would arrive in 3 weeks to marry her. "Prosody was an accident," the Reverend continued. "A wagon overturned on the Miller Road. Mr. Smith was traveling back early to surprise you, I understand. The horse spooked at something in the brush. He was thrown." Connie sat down on the settee because her legs suggested she should. Her hands found each other in her lap. Her face, she hoped, maintained the composure expected of a grieving fiancé. "He did not survive the injuries." The Reverend said quietly, "I am deeply sorry for your loss." Her loss. She turned the phrase over in her mind, examining it for the grief she knew she should feel. Robert was dead. The man she was supposed to marry in 3 weeks had been thrown from a wagon and killed. She should weep. She should cry out. She should collapse against the settee cushions and require smelling salts and the ministrations of concerned neighbors. Instead, she sat very still and thought about the pillowcases waiting on the ironing board. 12 pillowcases for a marriage that would not happen, a house with good bones that she would never live in, children she would never bear. "Is there someone I should send for?" the Reverend asked. "Your mother, perhaps? She's at Mrs. Hartley's." Connie's voice sounded normal, calm, as if discussing the weather or the price of flour. 2 houses past the milliner. The Reverend nodded and rose. "I'll fetch her directly. You should not be alone at such a time." Loneliness was not the problem. She was suspended, floating in a space between one life and another. The life where she married Robert Smith had ended. What came next remained unwritten. After the Reverend left, Connie returned to the ironing board. The iron had grown hot again. She pressed it across the pillowcase and watched the wrinkles disappear. And what was a woman supposed to do with 12 pillowcases and no husband to use them? The funeral was 3 days later. Connie wore black, borrowed from Mrs. Patterson, the dress slightly too large in the shoulders and too short at the hem. She stood beside her mother and accepted the condolences of people who had expected to attend her wedding instead. The church was full. Robert had been well liked, respectable, the sort of young man other mothers pointed to as an example. The Smith family stood on the opposite side of the grave, their grief raw and visible in ways hers was not. Robert's mother sobbed into a handkerchief, her shoulders shaking with each fresh wave of sorrow. His father stared at the coffin with the hollow expression of a man watching his legacy descend into the earth. They had other children, Connie knew, a daughter, married in Philadelphia. A younger son apprenticed to a lawyer, but Robert had been the one meant to carry on the family name in this town. The minister spoke of God's plan and eternal rest and the comfort of faith. Connie listened without hearing. The words washed over her like water over river stones, smooth and meaningless. She had been taught to find solace in Scripture, but Scripture offered no practical solution to her circumstances. Faith would not pay rent or put food on the table. The house with good bones, what would become of it now? Someone else would live there. Some other bride would arrange furniture in those rooms and hang curtains in those windows and bear children who would never know that the house had once been promised to Constance Green. After the service, after the murmured sympathies and the pressed hands and the assurances that time would heal, Connie's father drew her aside. His face was pale beneath his Sunday hat. "There are matters to discuss," he said. "Financial matters. The engagement contract included provisions." Connie nodded. She had not considered the practical implications. The dowry, the transfer of property, the careful negotiations that had preceded the announcement 3 years ago. "The Smith family will not pursue the original terms," her father continued, "given the circumstances, but there will be no settlement, no compensation for the broken engagement." "I did not expect there would be." Her father studied her for a long moment. "You're handling this well." She did not know how else to handle it. The future she had been prepared for had vanished, and now she must prepare for a different one. Grief seemed less useful than planning. "We'll speak more at home," her father said. "Your mother needs attending." Connie returned to her mother's side and guided her toward the carriage. The winter air bit at her cheeks. Somewhere, a wagon creaked along a frozen road, and the sound did not make her think of Robert's death. It made her think of the linens waiting in the chest beneath her window, and the house she would never see, and the children who would never exist. Tom, her mother, sent her on an errand that afternoon. Thread from the mercantile. A simple task meant perhaps to provide distraction, or perhaps simply because thread was needed and Connie was available to fetch it. She did not question the request. Movement was better than stillness. The walk took her past the church, past the smithy, past the row of houses where families she had known all her life continued their ordinary days. The sky hung low and gray, threatening snow that would not fall. The air smelled of coal smoke and horse manure, and the particular staleness of late winter. She purchased the thread and exchanged pleasantries with Mr. Owens behind the counter. Yes, such a tragedy about Mr. Smith. Yes, she was holding up as well as could be expected. Yes, her parents were well, thank you for asking. The walk home took her along the same route, past the same houses, beneath the same gray sky. She was thinking about dinner preparations, about whether her mother would want the leftover ham or prefer something fresh, when she turned the corner onto her street and stopped. Smoke. Not the thin curls that rose from chimneys. Not the controlled plumes of a kitchen fire or a burning pile of leaves. This smoke billowed black and thick, rising from a structure that blazed orange against the winter afternoon. Her parents' house. Connie ran. The thread fell from her fingers somewhere along the way, forgotten. She ran past neighbors who stood in the street, their faces lit by firelight, their mouths open in expressions of horror and helplessness. She ran toward the inferno that consumed everything she had ever known. Miss Green, someone caught her arm. Mr. Patterson from 3 doors down. His grip was iron. You can't go in there. Nobody can. My parents. The words scraped her throat. My parents are inside. Mr. Patterson's face told her everything before he spoke. The fire spread too fast. There was no time. Your father must have fallen asleep with his pipe. The curtains caught. The whole thing went up in minutes. The whole thing. The house where she had been born. The chest of linens beneath her bedroom window. The photograph of her grandmother on the mantel. Her father's pipe collection. Her mother's recipe book. The marriage certificate that proved her parents' union and the family Bible that recorded her birth. All of it. Gone. Connie stood in the street and watched the flames devour the last pieces of her life. The heat pressed against her face like a living thing, pushing her back even as her heart strained forward. Sparks rose into the gray sky like desperate prayers ascending toward a heaven that offered no intervention. Neighbors formed bucket lines that accomplished nothing against the blaze, passing water from hand to hand in a futile chain of hope. The roof collapsed with a sound like thunder, sending a fresh column of flame and ash into the darkening sky. Women gasped, men shouted. Children were pulled back to safer distances by mothers who understood that some lessons were too harsh for young eyes. She did not weep. She did not scream. She stood with Mr. Patterson's hand still gripping her arm, her borrowed shawl inadequate against the heat, her borrowed shoes rooted to the frozen street. She stood and watched and understood, with the clarity that comes only from complete disaster, that the girl who had ironed pillowcases that morning no longer existed. That girl had burned with the house and the linens and the parents who had raised her for a future that would never arrive. The fire burned through the night. By morning, only the chimney remained standing, a blackened finger pointing at an indifferent sky. Connie stood at the edge of the ruins as the sun rose, her borrowed coat inadequate against the cold, her borrowed boots too large for her feet. Mrs. Patterson had taken her in for the night, fed her broth she could not taste, given her a bed she could not sleep in, offered words of comfort that meant nothing because words could not rebuild a house or resurrect the dead. Her parents were gone. The constable had confirmed it, his voice gruff with the discomfort of delivering such news. 2 bodies recovered from the ashes, burned beyond recognition but identified by location. Her father in his reading chair, her mother in the kitchen. They had not suffered, the constable said. The smoke would have taken them quickly. Connie did not know if this was true or merely kind. She accepted it because accepting it was easier than imagining alternatives. Neighbors gathered as the morning progressed. They brought food she could not eat and sympathy she could not use. They spoke of tragedy and God's mysterious ways and the importance of family during difficult times. You'll stay with your aunt in Harrisburg, Mrs. Patterson said. Your father's sister. She'll take you in, of course. Of course, echoed Mrs. Morrison from across the street. Family looks after family, added Mr. Owens, who had walked from his mercantile to express his condolences. But Aunt Catherine did not come. Her letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by a boy on horseback who did not stay for a reply. The letter expressed sorrow for the losses. It mentioned the difficulties of taking in another mouth to feed. It included a small sum of money and best wishes for Connie's future. It did not include an invitation. Connie read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the pocket of her borrowed dress. She had one aunt, one living relative, and that relative had chosen money over family, a banknote over a niece. The neighbors' sympathy shifted after that. The women still brought food, but their eyes held something different now. Pity, perhaps, or calculation. A girl alone, without family, without resources, without the protection of an engagement or the promise of a husband. "There's always the factory," Mrs. Patterson said one evening, her voice carefully neutral. "They're hiring girls for the textile mill. It's honest work." Honest work. Connie understood the phrase and everything it implied. Factory girls occupied a different social stratum than shopkeepers' daughters engaged to respectable young men. Factory girls lived in boarding houses and worked 12-hour shifts and married, if they married at all, men who worked with their hands rather than their heads. She thought of the linens that had burned with her parents' house, the pillowcases she would never use, the tablecloths for dinner parties she would never host, the careful preparations for a life that had ceased to exist. "Thank you," she said to Mrs. Patterson. "I'll inquire tomorrow." She did not sleep that night. She lay in the borrowed bed and stared at the borrowed ceiling and understood that every choice available to her now was a choice born of necessity rather than preference. She could not return to the life she had known. She could not wait for rescue that would never come. She could only move forward, one step at a time, into whatever future remained. In the morning, she walked to the textile mill on the edge of town. The foreman looked her over with the practiced eye of a man who assessed women like livestock. "You've got hands," he said. "Can you work?" "Yes. 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, 40 cents daily, minus room and board if you need housing." She needed housing. Of course, she needed housing. The Pattersons had been clear that their hospitality could not extend indefinitely. "I'll take it," she said. The foreman made a note in his ledger. "Start Monday. Report to Mrs. Work Henshaw at the women's dormitory. She'll get you sorted." He did not wish her luck. He did not offer words of encouragement. She was a pair of hands to him, nothing more. Hands that could work a loom or sort thread or perform whatever task the mill required. Her name mattered less than her punctuality. Connie walked back through town with the weight of her new circumstances pressing down on her shoulders. She passed the mercantile where she had purchased thread a lifetime ago. She passed the church where she had expected to marry Robert Smith. She passed the blackened ruins of her parents' house, where nothing remained but ash and memory. She had crossed an invisible line. The shopkeeper's daughter, the respectable fiancée, the girl who ironed pillowcases for her future home. That girl had died with her parents in the fire. The woman who walked toward the textile mill was someone else entirely, someone harder, someone who understood that survival was not guaranteed and dignity was not given but earned. The wind picked up as she walked, carrying the scent of snow and coal smoke and the particular emptiness of a future with nothing certain in it. She did not look back. Chapter 2. The factory bell rang at 5 in the morning, its harsh clang cutting through the darkness of the dormitory. Connie's eyes opened before the sound faded, her body already trained after 2 weeks to anticipate the summons. Around her, other women stirred in their narrow beds, coughing and muttering and reaching for clothes laid out the night before. She dressed quickly in the gray dress Mrs. Henshaw had provided, a shapeless garment designed for function rather than appearance. The fabric was coarse against her skin, nothing like the cotton and linen she had worn in her previous life. But the dress was clean, and it covered her adequately, and it marked her as one of the mill workers rather than one of the women who stood on certain street corners after dark. The dormitory held 20 beds arranged in 2 rows, with barely enough space between them for a woman to stand. Privacy did not exist here. Connie had learned to change clothes with her back turned, to perform her morning ablutions at the shared basin without meeting anyone's eyes, to pretend that the sounds of 20 women sleeping and waking and living were not constantly in her ears. She was not the only respectable woman who had fallen. Several others occupied beds in this room, their histories, written in the way they held themselves apart from the rougher girls who had never known anything better. Miss Eleanor Whitman, a minister's daughter whose father had died, leaving debts. Mrs. Sarah Cole, a widow whose husband's business partner had absconded with the accounts. Miss Jane Perkins, whose family had vanished one night, leaving her to wake in an empty house with no explanation and no resources. They did not speak of their pasts. The factory did not care where they came from, only whether they could work. The walk to the mill floor took 7 minutes at a brisk pace. Connie had measured it during her first week, counting steps and turns until the route became automatic. Down the dormitory stairs, past the kitchen where weak coffee and thin porridge waited for those who had time to eat, through the courtyard where frost still clung to the cobblestones, into the long brick building where the looms waited. The noise hit her first, as it always did. The crash and clatter of machinery, the hiss of steam, the shouts of overseers trying to be heard above the din. The sound entered through her ears and settled in her bones, a constant vibration that did not stop until the evening bell released them. Her station was third from the end of the east row, a loom that produced cheap cotton fabric destined for shirts and undergarments. The work was simple enough to learn and difficult enough to sustain. Thread had to be loaded, tensions had to be adjusted, broken strands had to be tied with fingers that grew raw and cracked from the constant friction. Mr. Brennan, the floor overseer, walked his rounds with a pocket watch in one hand and a notebook in the other. He tracked production by the yard, marking numbers beside names, identifying the women who fell below expected output. His face was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply present, watching, measuring, and calculating the value of each worker in terms of fabric produced. Green. He stopped beside her loom during the second hour. "Your tension's off. Fix it." She fixed it. She did not explain that the mechanism had been sticking since before she arrived, that the previous worker had likely been dismissed for the same failing. Explanations did not matter. Results did. The morning passed in a blur of repetitive motion. Load the thread, check the tension, watch for breaks, tie the knots, repeat. The rhythm became a kind of meditation, her mind floating somewhere above her body while her hands performed their endless tasks. At noon, a whistle granted them 30 minutes for a meal. Connie ate the bread and cheese she had purchased the evening before, washing it down with water from the pump in the courtyard. The food was adequate, not good, but sufficient to fuel another 6 hours of work. She had learned to think of eating as maintenance rather than pleasure. The afternoon brought new challenges. A thread snapped badly, tangling the weave and requiring 20 minutes of careful work to repair. Mr. Brennan marked something in his notebook, his expression unchanged. Connie's fingers bled by the time she finished, small cuts from the tension of the thread. She wrapped them in scraps of fabric and continued working. When the evening bell finally rang, her shoulders ached, her hands throbbed, and her ears continued to echo with phantom machinery sounds. She walked back to the dormitory with the other women, none of them speaking, all of them conserving energy for the next day. The dormitory had been temporary, Mrs. Henshaw explained during Connie's third week, a place for new workers to stay while they found more permanent lodging. The factory did not provide charity. Room and board were deducted from wages, and the cost was steep enough that saving anything became nearly impossible. Connie found a room in a tenement house 3 streets from the mill. The building sagged in the middle as if exhausted by its own weight, and the stairs creaked ominously beneath her feet, and the hallway smelled of cabbage and unwashed bodies and something sharper that might have been rat droppings. Her room was barely large enough for a bed and a washstand. A single hook on the wall served as a closet. The floorboards were warped and uneven, creating gaps through which cold air rose from the floor below. The window looked out onto an alley where rubbish accumulated in rotting piles. In the mornings, she could hear rats scurrying through the garbage, their claws scratching against tin cans and broken crockery. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors' conversations, their arguments, their intimacies. The couple to the left fought every night about money. The woman to the right had a baby who cried for hours. The man upstairs drank himself into stupors and sometimes fell, his body hitting the floor above Connie's head with a sound that made her flinch even in her sleep. She shared the room with another mill worker, a girl named Bess who had grown up in tenements and saw nothing remarkable about the arrangement. Bess was perhaps 19, with rough hands and a practical manner that suggested she had never expected anything better from life and therefore could not be disappointed. Bess took the bed nearest the window. Connie took the one by the door. They divided the washstand by unspoken agreement and learned to sleep through each other's movements. "You talk in your sleep," Bess observed one morning, her tone matter-of-fact. "About fires and pillowcases. Makes no sense." "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." Bess shrugged. "Everyone talks in their sleep here. Mrs. Porter next door screams sometimes. You get used to it." Connie did not get used to it. She learned to endure it, which was different. The constant noise, the lack of privacy, and the awareness that illness or violence could arrive at any moment through the thin walls. She slept with her small purse of coins beneath her pillow and her shoes within arm's reach. Theft was common. Bess had warned her on the first night, explaining which neighbors could be trusted and which would steal the blankets off a sleeping woman. Connie had nothing worth stealing except her wages, and those she guarded carefully, counting them each night before she slept. 40 cents a day, 6 days a week. $2.40 each week. From that sum, she paid $1 for rent, another 50 cents for the coal that heated their small stove, and whatever remained went to food. If she were careful, if she bought only bread and cheese and occasionally a bit of meat, she could save perhaps 20 cents a week. 20 cents. A pittance. But it accumulated, week by week, into a small cushion against disaster. Connie counted her savings each Sunday, the one day the factory was closed, laying out the coins on her bed and calculating how many days of unemployment they would cover. Not many, never enough. One illness, one injury, one accusation of laziness or insubordination, and she would be back on the street with nothing. The letters stopped coming at the end of the second month. She had written to 3 women from her former life: Mrs. Morrison, who had always been kind; Miss Elizabeth Graves, whose mother had been friends with Connie's mother; Mrs. Walsh, who had once said that Connie was like a daughter to her. The first letters had been answered, brief, polite responses expressing sympathy for her losses and hope for her future. Mrs. Morrison had written that she prayed for Connie daily. Miss Graves had mentioned that her mother spoke often of Connie's mother. Mrs. Walsh had included a pressed flower from her garden and a promise to write again soon. The second letters received shorter replies, stilted phrases that spoke of busy schedules and family obligations. The handwriting seemed hurried. The sentiments seemed hollow. No one mentioned visiting. No one offered practical help. The replies arrived weeks after Connie had sent her letters, as if responding had become an unwelcome task, delayed until it could be postponed no longer. The third letter went unanswered entirely. Connie checked the post office every Sunday for 3 weeks, waiting for responses that never came. She composed a fourth letter in her mind, never written, imagining what she might say to bridge the growing silence. But there were no words that could make a factory girl acceptable to women who had never worked a day in their lives. Connie understood. She had crossed a line that polite society did not forgive. A factory girl, a tenement dweller, a woman who worked with her hands alongside immigrants and the daughters of drunkards. The Constance Green who had ironed pillowcases for her future home no longer existed, and the woman who had taken her place was not someone whom respectable ladies wished to acknowledge. She stopped writing after the third attempt. There was no point in pursuing connections that had been severed. Her old life was gone, and no amount of correspondence could resurrect it. The weeks passed in grinding sameness. Wake at 5, work until dark, eat what she could afford, sleep in a room that smelled of other people's lives, count her coins on Sunday and calculate how close she remained to disaster. Winter settled over the city in earnest, bringing bitter winds that crept through every crack in the tenement walls. Connie wore her coat to bed some nights, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. The coal she could afford was barely enough to take the edge off the chill, and she rationed it carefully, choosing warmth during sleeping hours over warmth during the brief evening time when she was awake. The factory was warmer, at least. The machinery generated heat that kept the air bearable even on the coldest days. Some women spoke of this as a blessing. Connie recognized it for what it was, another chain binding them to work they could not afford to leave. She spoke rarely. The other workers had their own concerns, their own alliances, their own survival strategies. Connie existed among them without belonging to them, a ghost from a world they had never known. Brennan continued his rounds, marking his notebook, adjusting production expectations, dismissing women who fell below acceptable standards. His pen moved across the page. Would her name be circled today? Would she be called aside and informed that her services were no longer required? She worked harder when she had those thoughts. Faster, more carefully. Her fingers grew calloused where they had been soft, and her shoulders developed muscles she had never known she possessed, and her mind retreated to a quiet place where only the rhythm of the loom mattered. This was survival, not living exactly, but not dying either. The girl's name was Margaret. She worked 2 looms down from Connie, a thin creature with red hair and a persistent cough that grew worse as the winter deepened. The cough was common in the mill, the cotton dust settled in the lungs, and the cold air aggravated the condition, and women learned to cough quietly so as not to attract attention. Margaret did not cough quietly. Her body bent double with each spasm, her hands leaving the loom to cover her mouth, her production suffering visibly. Mr. Brennan marked his notebook whenever he passed her station. The marks accumulated like a sentence waiting to be pronounced. Connie did not know Margaret well. They had exchanged perhaps a dozen words in 2 months, brief comments about thread quality or machine problems. But she recognized something in the girl's face: fear. The same fear that lived in Connie's chest whenever she watched Mr. Brennan's pen move across the page. The dismissal came on a Thursday afternoon. Mr. Brennan stopped beside Margaret's loom and spoke words that Connie could not hear above the machinery noise. Margaret's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She shook her head. She gestured at the loom, at her hands, at the fabric she had produced. Mr. Brennan's expression did not change. Margaret began to cry. The tears streamed down her cheeks as she pleaded, her lips forming words that the machinery swallowed. Connie could guess what she was saying. "Please, I'll do better. I need this work. I have nowhere else to go." Mr. Brennan simply pointed toward the exit. His finger did not waver. His face did not soften. He had delivered this sentence before to other women, and he would deliver it again. Margaret's tears meant nothing to the fabric production quotas, to the profit margins, to the endless appetite of the looms. 5 minutes later, Margaret was gone. She walked out through the factory doors with her shoulders bowed and her hands empty, disappearing into a world that had no use for a woman with weak lungs and a persistent cough. A new girl took her place by Monday, a sturdier creature with no cough and strong hands. The looms continued their endless clatter. Production continued. The factory did not mourn. Connie worked her station with renewed attention that evening, checking her thread tensions obsessively, tying her knots with extra care. Her fingers ached and her eyes burned from the cotton dust, but she did not slow down. She could not slow down. Margaret had been useful until she wasn't. The same could happen to anyone. The same could happen to Connie if she allowed herself one moment of weakness, one illness, one complaint. The factory consumed workers the way the loom consumed thread, endlessly, without sentiment, without memory. She walked home through the darkening streets and counted her coins and calculated again how many days she could survive without work. The number had not improved. It never improved, no matter how carefully she saved. The room was cold when she arrived. Bess had not yet returned from her own shift at a different factory across town. Connie lit the small stove and waited for the coal to catch, her breath visible in the frigid air. Outside, a woman screamed something about money, and a man's voice responded with words that Connie tried not to hear. She thought about Margaret, dismissed without warning or recourse. She thought about the new girl already installed at the loom, producing fabric as if nothing had changed. She thought about the 20 cents she managed to save each week and how quickly that savings would disappear if she became unable to work. Survival depended on usefulness. This was the lesson Margaret's dismissal had taught her, the lesson the factory reinforced every day with its relentless demands. A woman without usefulness had no place in this world, no protection, no value. Connie had been raised to believe that her worth came from fulfilling roles chosen for her: wife, mother, keeper of a respectable home. Those roles were gone now, burned away with her parents' house and buried with Robert Smith's body. The role that remained was simpler and harsher: worker, a pair of hands attached to a body that must not falter. She went to bed with her coins beneath her pillow and her shoes by the door and her body aching from 12 hours of labor. Tomorrow, the bell would ring at 5, and she would rise and she would walk to the mill and she would work until darkness fell again. This was her life now. She did not know how long she could sustain it. She only knew that stopping was not an option. The fire in the stove burned down to embers. Bess returned and climbed into her bed without speaking, her movements careful and quiet in the darkness. The tenement settled into uneasy quiet, broken by coughs and crying and the endless small sounds of too many people living too close together. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed. A man shouted. The baby next door began to wail again. Connie listened to the familiar symphony of poverty and desperation. 2 months ago, she had never heard such sounds. 2 months ago, she had slept in a room of her own, in a house with solid walls, in a world where safety was assumed rather than hoped for. That world was gone. This world remained. She closed her eyes and did not dream of pillowcases. She did not dream of the house with good bones or the linens she had ironed or the life she had been promised. Those things belonged to a different woman, a woman who no longer existed. She dreamed of nothing at all. Chapter 3. The newspaper was 3 days old, its pages creased and stained from passing through a dozen hands before reaching the factory break room. Connie found it wedged between a crate and the wall during her noon meal, abandoned by some previous reader who had extracted whatever information they needed and moved on. She did not usually read newspapers. The headlines spoke of political matters and business dealings and social events that no longer concerned her. Factory girls did not vote. Factory girls did not invest. Factory girls did not attend the parties described in the society pages. But the paper was there, and her bread and cheese required only one hand to eat, and the alternative was sitting in silence while the other women clustered in groups she had never been invited to join. The front page held nothing of interest, neither did the second or third. She turned the pages methodically, scanning headlines without absorbing content, until a small advertisement in the corner of the 5th page caught her eye. Matrimonial opportunities in Texas. The words were set in plain type, unremarkable among the other small notices that crowded the page. Advertisements for patent medicines, announcements of properties for sale, offers of employment in distant cities. But this advertisement was different. Respectable gentleman, established landowner, seeks wife of good character and domestic capability. Passage provided, marriage upon arrival assured, inquiries welcome. Connie read the words twice, then a third time. The language was formal, almost legal in its precision. No mention of love or affection or romantic feeling. No description of the gentleman beyond his respectability and his land. No indication of what kind of life awaited a woman who answered such an advertisement. Just an offer. Passage west. Marriage assured. A way out. The noon whistle blew, signaling the end of the break. Connie folded the newspaper and tucked it beneath her shawl, returning to her loom with the advertisement pressed against her heart. That evening, in the cramped room she shared with Bess, Connie spread the newspaper on her bed and studied the advertisement by the light of their single candle. The words had not changed during the hours she spent at the loom, but they seemed different now, more real, more possible. Respectable gentleman, established landowner, wife of good character. She met the requirements, technically. Her character had never been questioned before her fall into factory work. Her domestic skills were adequate. She could cook and clean and sew and manage a household, though she had never been required to demonstrate these abilities under frontier conditions. Texas. The word conjured images from newspaper illustrations and dime novels, vast open spaces, cattle ranches, small towns far from the crowded tenements of the East, a different world entirely from the one she had known or the one she now endured. "What's that you're reading?" Bess asked from her bed, her voice heavy with the exhaustion that weighed on them both at the end of a 12-hour shift. "Nothing important." Connie folded the newspaper and slid it beneath her pillow. "Just an old paper someone left in the break room." Bess made a sound that might have been an acknowledgement or might have been the beginning of sleep. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into the rhythm of exhaustion, leaving Connie alone with her thoughts. She lay in the darkness and listened to the familiar sounds of the tenement, the baby crying next door, the man upstairs stumbling to his bed, the couple to the left arguing in voices too tired to carry real heat. These sounds had become her life, as familiar as the factory bell and the rattle of the loom. But they were not her future. They could not be her future. If she remained here, working 12-hour days and saving 20 cents a week, she would grow old in rooms like this one. She would cough like Margaret. She would be dismissed when her usefulness ended. She would die alone in poverty, forgotten by the respectable world that had once claimed her as its own. The advertisement offered something else, not happiness necessarily. Not love or romance or the comfortable marriage she had once been promised to Robert Smith, but something different, a chance, a change, a future that was unknown rather than grimly predictable. She retrieved the newspaper from beneath her pillow and traced the words with her finger in the darkness. "Respectable gentleman, passage provided, marriage upon arrival." For the first time in months, Connie allowed herself to imagine something other than survival. She wrote her first reply the following Sunday, using paper purchased from a stationer's shop and ink borrowed from the factory clerk who handled correspondence. The words came slowly, each sentence weighed and measured before being committed to the page. "Dear Sir, I write in response to your advertisement seeking a wife of good character and domestic capability. I am 22 years of age, in good health, and possessed of the skills necessary to manage a household. I am willing to relocate to Texas and enter into the arrangement you have described." She stopped there, uncertain how to continue. Should she mention her circumstances, her losses, the factory work that marked her as something less than respectable? She crumpled the paper and began again. "Dear Sir, your advertisement has come to my attention, and I believe I may suit your requirements. I am a woman of education and refinement, experienced in domestic matters, seeking an opportunity to establish myself in new circumstances. Too formal, too vague, too much like the letters she used to write to Mrs. Morrison and Miss Graves, letters that had gone unanswered." She crumpled that paper too and started a third time. The candle burned low as she drafted and discarded attempt after attempt. Each version seemed either too honest or too evasive, too eager or too cold. She did not know how to present herself to a stranger who sought a wife through newspaper advertisements. She did not know what such a man wanted to hear. Finally, as the candle guttered in its holder, she wrote a version that seemed acceptable. "Dear Sir, I write regarding your matrimonial advertisement. I am 22, healthy and competent in domestic skills, including cooking, sewing, and household management. I am currently employed but seeking stable circumstances and a respectable situation. I am prepared to travel to Texas and fulfill the duties of a wife should you find my qualifications suitable. I have enclosed no photograph, as I possess none. I can describe myself as ordinary in appearance, slight of build, with brown hair and good teeth. I am not beautiful, but I am practical and willing to work. Please respond to the address below if you wish to continue this correspondence. Respectfully, Constance Green." She read the letter 3 times, searching for errors or weaknesses. The tone was businesslike, almost cold. She had mentioned no feelings, expressed no hopes, and made no promises beyond basic competence. If the gentleman sought a romantic bride, he would not find her appealing. But if he sought what the advertisement claimed, a wife of good character and domestic capability, then perhaps her letter would serve. She sealed the envelope, addressed it to the post office box listed in the advertisement, and set it on the washstand to mail in the morning. Then she extinguished the candle and lay in the darkness, listening to Bess breathe and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Prosody Prisrems. The weeks that followed were the longest of Connie's life. She continued her work at the factory, loading thread and checking tensions and tying knots until her fingers knew the motions without conscious direction. She continued her evening routine, walking home through darkening streets, cooking what simple meals she could afford, counting her coins, and calculating her precarious position. But underneath the routine, underneath the careful blankness she wore like armor, anticipation grew. She checked the post office every Sunday after church, waiting in line with other hopeful recipients for letters that might or might not arrive. The building was crowded on Sundays, filled with immigrants waiting for news from home, businessmen expecting invoices and payments, and women like herself who had placed their hopes in envelopes and sent them into the unknown. The first Sunday brought nothing. The clerk checked the box marked G and shook his head, and Connie walked back to her tenement through streets that seemed grayer than before. The second Sunday brought nothing. She stood in line for 20 minutes, only to receive the same shake of the head, the same empty box, the same long walk home. On the third Sunday, she began to accept that her letter had gone unanswered. Perhaps the gentleman had received dozens of responses and chosen another. Perhaps he had found her letter too cold, too practical, too lacking in the feminine warmth a man might expect from a prospective bride. Perhaps the entire advertisement had been a fraud, designed to collect money or information from desperate women. She almost did not go to the post office on the fourth Sunday. What was the point of hoping when hope had proven so consistently futile? But habit carried her there, and stubbornness kept her in line, and something that might have been faith made her ask the clerk one more time. On the fourth Sunday, a letter waited in her box. The envelope was plain, the handwriting precise and impersonal. The postmark showed a town in Texas she had never heard of, a place called Crawford that existed only as a smudge of ink on paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it, there in the post office lobby, unable to wait until she reached the privacy of her room. Dear Miss Green, your letter has been received and reviewed. Your qualifications appear acceptable for the position I have advertised. I am prepared to offer you passage to Texas, where we will meet and determine our mutual suitability for marriage. Enclosed, please find a voucher for train travel from your city to Crawford, Texas. The journey takes approximately 1 week. Upon your arrival, you will be met at the station and escorted to my property. Should you accept this arrangement, please confirm your intended departure date by return post. Should you decline, please return the enclosed voucher and consider this matter closed. I look forward to making your acquaintance. Yours respectfully, Edgar Hawthorne. Connie read the letter twice, then examined the voucher and closed with it. The document appeared genuine, printed on official railway paper and stamped with the seal of the line that ran westward. It represented more money than she could save in 6 months of factory work. No probing questions, no requests for references, photographs, or proof of her claims. Just an offer, cold and businesslike, matching the tone of her own letter. She should be suspicious. A respectable gentleman did not marry strangers without investigation. A wise woman did not travel across the country to meet a man she knew nothing about. The stories of mail-order brides gone wrong were common enough. Cautionary tales shared in hushed voices about women who arrived to find themselves in circumstances far different from what they had been promised. She had heard such stories in the tenement, whispered between women who knew other women who had taken the same risk. Brides who arrived to find their prospective husbands already married. Brides who were put to work in establishments that no respectable woman would enter. Brides who simply disappeared, their letters home growing shorter and then stopping entirely, their fates unknown and perhaps unknowable. Edgar Hawthorne might be any of these men. He might be worse. His letter revealed nothing of his character, nothing of his intentions, nothing of the life that awaited her in Crawford, Texas. She would be traveling 1,000 miles to marry a stranger, trusting her future to a newspaper advertisement and a train voucher. But what alternative did she have? The factory would continue to take from her until her body failed. The tenement would continue until her money ran out. The careful, grinding poverty of her current existence offered no escape, no improvement, no hope of anything beyond survival. Texas offered uncertainty. It might be worse than what she had now, but it might also be better. And even the possibility of better was more than she had dared to hope for since the fire. She walked home from the post office with the letter in her pocket and the voucher clutched in her hand. The streets seemed different now, less permanent, already beginning to fade into memory. The factory, the tenement, the endless rhythm of work and sleep and barely enough food. She would leave it all behind. Selling her possessions took 3 days. She had little enough to sell, but every penny mattered for the journey ahead. The train voucher covered passage, but it did not cover food during the journey or lodging if delays occurred or any of the countless small expenses that travel required. The winter coat, too thin for real cold but better than nothing, went to a woman in the tenement who had even less. Mrs. Kowalski was her name, a Polish immigrant whose husband had died in a factory accident, leaving her with 3 children and no income. Connie accepted $2, knowing the coat was worth more, but unable to bargain with someone whose need was so visible. Mrs. Kowalski thanked her in broken English and pressed her hand with fingers roughened by work, and Connie walked away feeling as though she had done something good, even as she impoverished herself further. Her second dress, the one she wore on Sundays, went to a pawnbroker who gave her 50 cents and a look that suggested he was doing her a favor. The dress was modest and well-made, purchased during her former life when such things mattered. Now it was simply cloth, convertible to coins that would buy bread and cheese during the long journey west. The small trunk she had purchased to hold her belongings when she first moved to the tenement brought another $1. The pawnbroker examined it with the practiced eye of a man who assessed desperation for a living. He offered 75 cents initially, and Connie countered with $1.25, and they settled on $1 with the understanding that she would also purchase a carpet bag from his stock. The carpet bag cost 30 cents, leaving her with a net gain of 70 cents but a means to carry what little remained. She would travel light now, lighter than she had ever traveled. 1 dress on her back, 1 spare set of undergarments, a hairbrush, a comb, and a small sewing kit for repairs. The essentials of survival and no more. Her savings, accumulated coin by coin over months of deprivation, amounted to $4.60. Combined with what she had earned from selling her possessions, she would arrive in Texas with just over $8, enough for emergencies, not enough for a return trip if things went wrong. She did not allow herself to think about return trips. This was not a visit. This was not an experiment. This was an ending and a beginning, a door closing behind her as another opened ahead. On her last night in the tenement, she sat on the edge of her bed and looked around the cramped room that had been her home for nearly 3 months. The warped floorboards, the stained walls, the single window looking out on the alley. She had never been happy here, but she had survived. That counted for something. Bess watched her from the other bed, her expression curious but not unkind. They had never become friends, but they had shared space without conflict, which was perhaps a kind of friendship in this world. "You're really going then," Bess said. It was not quite a question. "I am. To marry a man you've never met." "Yes." Bess shook her head slowly, but her eyes held what might have been respect. "Takes courage, that does, or desperation. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." Connie did not respond. She was not certain which word applied to her own situation. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps the distinction only mattered to people who had choices she no longer possessed. She slept poorly that night, her mind racing through possibilities and fears and fragments of hope she tried not to examine too closely. The train would leave in the morning. By evening, she would be miles from all she had ever known. By the end of the week, she would be in Texas, meeting the man who might become her husband. She did not allow herself to hope. Hope was too dangerous, too fragile, too likely to shatter against the hard edges of reality. She only allowed herself to endure. Endurance had brought her this far. Endurance would carry her the rest of the way. When dawn came, she rose, dressed in her single remaining dress, and walked out of the tenement without looking back. The bag in her hand was light. The letter in her pocket was heavy with promise and danger. The train waited at the station, massive and dark, belching steam into the cold morning air. Other passengers moved around her, families, businessmen, soldiers, and women traveling alone like herself. They climbed aboard with expressions ranging from excitement to fear to the blank endurance that Connie recognized from her own mirror. She found her seat in the third-class car, a wooden bench beside a window that looked out onto the platform. The station was already growing busy with the morning's commerce: porters loading luggage, conductors checking tickets, vendors selling newspapers and snacks to passengers who could afford such luxuries. Connie pressed her hand against the glass and watched the city she was leaving. Somewhere out there was the factory where she had worked. Somewhere was the tenement where she had slept. Somewhere were the ruins of her parents' house, long since cleared away and forgotten. She would not miss any of it. She would not mourn. She would only move forward into whatever future awaited her in Texas. No one was there to see her off. The train lurched, then began to move. The platform slid past the window, then the station, then the edges of the city itself. Connie watched it all disappear and did not permit herself to cry. Chapter 4. The train car swayed gently as it picked up speed, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails becoming a constant backdrop to whatever else. Connie sat with her carpet bag on her lap, her hands folded over its worn leather handles, watching the city give way to farms and then to open country. Around her, the third-class car held perhaps 30 passengers. Families occupied the benches near the front, mothers corralling children who wanted to run up and down the aisle, fathers dozing with hats pulled over their eyes. Businessmen in cheaper suits worked on papers or read newspapers folded to fit the narrow spaces. Soldiers in blue uniforms played cards in the corner, their laughter carrying over the noise of the train. And scattered among them, traveling singly or in small groups, were women. Some wore wedding rings. Others did not. A few had the look of servants traveling to new positions, but several had the same expression she suspected she wore herself: a careful blankness, an enforced calm, the look of women traveling toward futures they could not quite imagine. Mail-order brides. She was not the only one on this train. The realization brought neither comfort nor alarm. These women were strangers, bound for different destinations, answering different advertisements. Whatever awaited them in the West had nothing to do with what awaited her. They were not allies or competitors or friends. They were simply fellow travelers, sharing space temporarily before their paths diverged forever. She turned her attention back to the window. The countryside was changing already, the dense forests and cultivated fields of the east giving way to broader expanses. The sky seemed larger here, stretching uninterrupted toward horizons that appeared impossibly distant. She had never seen so much empty land. Empty. That was the word that kept returning to her mind. The land outside the window was empty of whatever was familiar, whatever she had known. Empty of factories and tenements, empty of the neighbors whose lives she had heard through thin walls, empty of the church where her parents were buried, and the ruins of the house where she had grown up. She was leaving it all behind. Every mile the train traveled carried her farther from her old life and closer to what was essentially entirely unknown. The first night on the train taught her much that she had not anticipated. The wooden benches, adequate for sitting, became instruments of torture when used for sleeping. The car grew cold as darkness fell, and the thin shawl she had kept was ineffective against the chill. Other passengers shifted and muttered throughout the night, their restlessness compounding her own. She dozed in fits and starts, her neck aching from awkward angles, her back protesting each bump and sway. When dawn finally broke, gray and reluctant through the windows, exhaustion pressed down on her heavier than after 12 hours at the loom. But the train continued. It did not care about her discomfort. It simply moved forward, mile after mile, carrying her westward whether she was rested or not. Breakfast came from her carpet bag, bread she had purchased before departure, slightly stale now, and cheese that was beginning to sweat in the warmth of the car. She ate mechanically, watching the landscape scroll past, trying to identify landmarks she had never learned to recognize. First time west? The voice came from the bench beside her. Connie turned to see a woman who looked about 10 years older than her, with hair streaked with gray and a face marked by years of quiet endurance. This woman hadn't been there when Connie fell asleep. Yes, Connie said carefully. First time. The woman nodded as if this confirmed something she already knew. I can always tell. It's the way you look at the land, like it might swallow you whole. It's very different from what I'm used to. City girl? Originally, more recently, factory work. The woman made a sound that might have been sympathy or understanding. I'm Harriet Morse. I've made this trip before, going back to see family in the East and then returning home. Constance Green. Connie. Pleasure, Connie. Harriet settled more comfortably against the bench. Mind if I ask what brings you west? Looking for work or something else? Connie hesitated. The truth seemed both too personal and too ridiculous to share with a stranger. A mail-order bride advertisement, a letter from a man she had never met, a train voucher that represented either salvation or disaster. I'm getting married, she said finally, a gentleman in Texas. Harriet's expression shifted in ways Connie could not quite read. I see. One of those arrangements, then? Yes. Have you met him? No. Harriet nodded slowly, her gaze turning toward the window. I knew a girl once, back before the war. Answered an advertisement like that. Packed her things and headed west to marry a man who claimed to own a farm in Kansas. What happened to her? Farm was real enough. So was the man. But he had neglected to mention that he already had a wife, and what he wanted wasn't a second marriage, but a servant who wouldn't cost him wages. Harriet's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were describing the weather. She ended up working that farm for 3 years before she found a way to leave. Connie's hands tightened on her carpetbag. I appreciate the warning. Not warning you exactly, just telling you what I know. Some of those arrangements work out fine, some don't. The men who advertise for wives aren't always who they claim to be. Harriet turned back to face her. You strike me as a sensible girl. Keep your wits about you when you arrive. Don't sign anything until you're certain, and make sure you know where the nearest town is in case you need to leave in a hurry. Sound advice, practical advice. The kind of advice Connie should have sought before boarding the train, but there had been no one to ask. The women in the tenement knew nothing of Texas. The factory workers knew nothing of mail-order marriages. She had made her decision in isolation, and now she was carrying it out in isolation. And whatever awaited her at the end of the journey was hers alone to face. Thank you, she said to Harriet. I'll remember. The days blurred together as the train continued westward. Connie lost track of how long she had been traveling, her sense of time reduced to the cycles of light and darkness that passed outside the window. The landscape changed gradually, growing drier and more open, the forests giving way to grasslands that stretched unbroken to the horizon. On the second day, they crossed a river so wide she could not see the opposite bank clearly. The train rumbled over a bridge that seemed impossibly fragile, the water rushing brown and swift beneath them. Connie gripped the edge of her seat and tried not to think about what would happen if the bridge gave way. There would be no rescue. There would be no survival. The river would swallow them all and continue on its way as if nothing had happened. But the bridge held, and the train continued, and another river appeared behind them like a memory already fading. On the third day, she saw her first herd of cattle. Seemingly thousands of animals spread across the grassland, their brown and white bodies moving in slow patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Cowboys on horseback rode among them, specks of movement against the vastness of the land. This was Texas. This was the world she was entering. She spoke to other women when opportunities arose. A young bride named Dorothy, traveling to meet a husband she had corresponded with for 6 months, who spoke of him with hope that seemed almost painful in its brightness. A widow named Mrs. Carson, returning to her son's ranch after burying her sister in Philadelphia, who offered Connie dried apples from her supplies. A pair of sisters, Lily and Rose, who were traveling to work in a hotel in Dallas and spoke of the West as if it were made of gold and promises. Each woman had her own story. Each woman was traveling toward her own future. But beneath the differences, Connie recognized something familiar. They were all doing what women had always done, following circumstance rather than choice, adapting to situations they had not created, making the best of hands they had been dealt rather than those they would have chosen. Dorothy spoke of love, but her eyes held the same careful calculation Connie recognized from her own mirror. "He writes such lovely letters," Dorothy confided one afternoon, her voice soft with what wanted to be hope. "He describes his house and his work and the sunsets over the prairie. I feel as though I know him already." But letters could lie. Letters could paint pictures that bore no resemblance to reality. Connie had written her own letter to Edgar Hawthorne, carefully crafted to present herself in the best possible light. And what did he imagine she was like based on those words? Probably nothing like the exhausted woman on this train, with her wrinkled dress and her empty stomach and her determination to survive regardless of circumstance. Mrs. Carson spoke of family duty, but her tired face suggested duties that had drained rather than sustained her. "A woman goes where her family needs her," she said, accepting this as natural law rather than choice. "My son needs help on the ranch. His wife died last year, and there are children to raise. What else would I do?" Lily and Rose spoke of adventure, but their worn dresses and careful spending revealed the desperation beneath the excitement. "Dallas is going to be wonderful," Lily declared, her voice bright with manufactured enthusiasm. "Hotels are where the money is. Rich men passing through, looking for entertainment and willing to pay for it." She caught Connie's expression and laughed. "Not that kind of entertainment. Dinner service, room cleaning, respectable work." But her sister's face suggested that respectable work might not be the only option they were considering. They were all survivors. They were all making choices that were not really choices at all. On the fourth night, Connie sat alone by the window, watching stars emerge over land that seemed to have no end. The train had stopped at some small town to take on water and coal, and the silence was almost startling after days of constant motion. She could hear crickets outside, and somewhere in the distance a dog barking. Her destination was close now. The conductor had announced that they would arrive in Crawford by the following afternoon. Tomorrow, she would meet Edgar Hawthorne. Tomorrow, she would see the ranch where she was supposed to live. Tomorrow, everything would change. She tried to imagine him. The advertisement had said respectable gentleman. His letter had been formal and businesslike. But these were words, not flesh, and she had no way of knowing what kind of man would greet her when she stepped off the train. She thought about the men she had known in her life. Her father, steady and undemonstrative, who had provided for his family without much tenderness. Robert Smith, whose face she was already beginning to forget, who would have been adequate but never exciting. The factory foreman, who had looked at her like a piece of equipment to be evaluated for usefulness. Mr. Hawthorne might be like any of these men, or none of them, or someone entirely different. The stars wheeled overhead as the night deepened. Other passengers slept around her, their breathing creating a soft rhythm of unconscious life. The train began to move again, pulling away from the small town, resuming its westward journey. Tomorrow. Everything would be decided tomorrow. He might be kind. He might be cruel. He might be all that he claimed or not at all. She had no way of knowing. She had only the decision she had already made, the train that was carrying her forward, the future that waited regardless of her fears. She did not allow herself to imagine romance. She did not allow herself to imagine affection or tenderness or the slow growth of love that her mother had promised would come from sensible marriages. Those were fantasies, and fantasies were dangerous for women in her position. She imagined only survival. She imagined only practicality. She imagined making herself useful enough that Edgar Hawthorne would have no reason to regret his choice, whatever that choice had been based on. This was not a love story. This was a business arrangement, and she would approach it with the same careful pragmatism she had brought to every challenge since the fire. The morning of arrival dawned clear and warm. the Texas sun already blazing even at this early hour. Connie gathered her few belongings and smoothed her dress as best she could, acutely aware of how travel-worn she must appear. 5 days on a train had left their mark. Her dress was wrinkled, her hair was escaping its pins, and her face, in the small mirror she carried, looked pale and tired. This would be her physical state when she met her prospective husband. Rumpled and exhausted, with $8 in her pocket and all that she owned in a single carpet bag. Not exactly the entrance a bride was supposed to make, but she was not exactly a bride, not yet. She was an applicant, presenting herself for approval, hoping to meet whatever standards Edgar Hawthorne had set. The advertisement had promised marriage upon arrival, but the letter had spoken of determining mutual suitability. She was not yet certain which version of events would prove accurate. The train began to slow as Crawford came into view. It was smaller than she had expected, a cluster of buildings arranged along a single main street, with scattered structures spreading out toward the surrounding ranch land. Not a town, really. More of a settlement, a place that existed to serve the ranches and farms that surrounded it. She counted the buildings as the train approached. A general store with a wooden sign swinging in the breeze, a blacksmith's shop with smoke rising from its chimney, a small church with a steeple that listed slightly to the left, a saloon with bat-wing doors and a horse tied to a hitching post outside. Perhaps a dozen other structures, some homes and some businesses, all weathered by sun and wind and the relentless Texas climate. This was where she would live. This was the town she would call her own, assuming Edgar Hawthorne found her acceptable. It was not at all like the city she had left behind, with its crowded streets and factory smoke and tenements stacked like dominoes waiting to fall. It was sparse and exposed and utterly foreign. Would she ever feel at home here? Harriet had left the train 2 days earlier in a larger town whose name Connie could not remember. Dorothy had departed yesterday, met at the station by a young man who had seemed genuinely pleased to see her. Mrs. Carson was continuing further west, and Lily and Rose had disembarked this morning in Dallas. Connie was alone now, truly alone, with no one to wish her well or warn her of dangers. The train lurched to a final stop. Steam hissed. Passengers began to gather their possessions and move toward the exits. Connie stood, adjusted her carpet bag, and walked toward the door. Her legs were unsteady from days of sitting, and her heart was beating faster than she wanted to admit. This was it, the end of the journey, the beginning of whatever came next. The platform was small, a wooden structure barely wide enough for the passengers to disembark. A handful of people waited there, faces she did not recognize, lives she would never know. She scanned them quickly, looking for someone who might be Edgar Hawthorne, someone who might be looking for her. A man stood apart from the others, his posture straight, his clothing clean and well-made. He was perhaps 40, with a face that was neither handsome nor ugly, merely ordinary, and eyes that assessed her with the same calculating expression she had seen in businessmen reviewing inventory. His clothing marked him as prosperous but not wealthy, respectable but not distinguished. A rancher, perhaps, a landowner, the kind of man who advertised for a wife because he could not be bothered to court one. She had a sudden, terrible certainty that this was him. This was Edgar Hawthorne. This was the man she had traveled 1,000 miles to marry. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He did not welcome her or express pleasure at her arrival. He simply looked at her, measuring, evaluating, deciding whether she met his specifications, as if she were livestock at auction, as if she were machinery being inspected for defects. The heat pressed down on her, relentless after the relative coolness of the train car. Dust swirled around her feet. The town stretched behind him, small and weathered and utterly unfamiliar. She was 1,000 miles from all she had known, with $8 in her pocket and nowhere else to go. This was the moment. This was the beginning of whatever her life would become. Connie stepped off the train and into her new life, refusing to let her fear show on her face. She kept her spine straight and her expression calm, meeting his assessing gaze with a composure she had perfected during months of factory work and tenement living. If he wanted to evaluate her, she would give him nothing to criticize. She had come too far to turn back now. Chapter 5. Miss Green, I presume. His voice was flat, neither welcoming nor hostile, merely acknowledging her existence as one might acknowledge the arrival of a shipment of goods. Edgar Hawthorne did not extend his hand or remove his hat or offer any of the courtesies a gentleman might show to a lady he intended to marry. "Mr. Hawthorne," Connie replied, matching his tone. If he wanted formality, she would give him formality. "Thank you for meeting me. The wagon's this way." He turned without waiting for her response and walked toward a weathered buckboard hitched at the edge of the platform. Connie followed, her carpetbag growing heavier with each step, the Texas sun beating down on her travel-worn dress. This was not the greeting she had imagined. But then again, she had trained herself not to imagine all that much. The ride to the ranch took nearly an hour. Hawthorne drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands steady on the reins. He had not offered to take her carpetbag or help her onto the wagon seat. He had simply waited, with the patience of a man who expected compliance and saw no need to encourage it. Connie sat beside him on the hard wooden seat and tried to take in the landscape that would become her new home. The wagon rattled over rutted roads, and each jolt sent shocks through her spine. She gripped the edge of the seat to keep from being thrown against Hawthorne or tumbling off entirely. He did not slow for the rougher patches. He did not adjust his course to avoid the deepest ruts. Either he did not notice her discomfort or he did not care. She suspected the latter. The land was vast and brown and utterly foreign in the world as she had known it. Scattered cattle dotted the distant hills, and fences marked property lines that stretched toward horizons she could barely comprehend. The grass was shorter here than in the east, yellowed by sun and heat, and the trees were sparse and twisted and looked as if they were clinging to life through sheer stubbornness. "That's the property line," Hawthorne announced suddenly, pointing toward a fence that ran perpendicular to the road. 3,000 acres in all, cattle mostly, some horses. 3,000 acres. Connie had no frame of reference for such a number. The house where she had grown up had occupied perhaps an eighth of an acre. The factory where she had worked could have fit inside one of these endless fields and disappeared without a trace. "It's very large," she said, because a remark was expected. "Large enough." Hawthorne's jaw tightened slightly. "Was larger when my father ran it, before the war, before it all changed." She did not ask what had changed. The answer was written in the tension of his shoulders, in the careful maintenance of his clothing, in the way he spoke of the ranch as if defending it from silent accusations. This was a man who had once been more prosperous than he was now, clinging to the appearance of respectability while the substance crumbled beneath him. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise. It was larger than Connie had expected. A two-story structure with a wide porch and windows that reflected the afternoon sun. But even from a distance, she could see the signs of neglect. Paint peeling from the walls, a fence rail hanging loose, weeds growing where gardens should have been. A barn stood to the left of the house, its doors ajar. Beyond it, several smaller outbuildings clustered together in various states of disrepair. A chicken coop, a smokehouse. What might have been a root cellar, its entrance nearly hidden by overgrown brush. The property had the look of a place that had once been prosperous and was now merely surviving. She counted the windows as they approached. 7 on the upper floor, 5 below, plus the front door with its peeling paint and rusted hinges. The porch wrapped around 2 sides of the house, but the boards sagged in places, and the railing listed to the left as if exhausted by its own weight. Prosperity fading, pride remaining. She understood now why Hawthorne had advertised for a wife. He needed help, not a partner. He needed labor, not love. "Your room is through here." Hawthorne led her into the house and through a series of dim hallways, past a parlor that showed signs of former elegance, past a kitchen that was clean but sparse, until they reached a door at the back of the house. He opened it to reveal a small room, barely larger than the one she had shared in the tenement, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. A servant's room. Not the master bedroom, not even a guest room, the quarters of hired help. Connie stood in the doorway and looked at the narrow bed, at the plain walls, at the single small window that looked out onto the back of the property. This was where he expected her to sleep. This was where she was meant to live. "I thought," she began carefully, "that we were to be married." Hawthorne's expression did not change. "In time, when we've determined our mutual suitability." Your letter spoke of marriage upon arrival. My letter spoke of determining mutual suitability. You must have misread it. His voice carried a note of finality, a dismissal of any objection she might raise. "The arrangement is simple. You'll work. You'll prove your value. If you're suitable, we'll discuss next steps." Suitable, value, work. The words circled in Connie's mind, rearranging themselves into a picture quite different from what she had imagined. She had come to Texas expecting to be a wife, perhaps not a beloved one, but a wife nonetheless. What Hawthorne was offering was something else entirely. "I see," she said. Her voice remained steady, though something inside her was beginning to crack. "And what does this work entail?" "Cooking, cleaning, managing the household, the tasks a wife would perform, more or less." His smile was thin, practiced, a businessman's smile that revealed nothing of what lay beneath. "Consider it a trial period, for both of us." A trial period. As if she were applying for a position rather than entering a marriage. As if her passage west had been not a bride's journey, but an interview for employment without wages. Connie set her carpet bag on the narrow bed. She had $8 and no way home. She had no references, no connections, no one to appeal to for help. The train that had brought her here would not carry her back without money she did not possess. She was trapped, not by chains or locks, but by circumstance and geography, and the careful planning of a man who had advertised for a wife because unpaid domestic labor was cheaper than hiring servants. "I understand," she said, because what else could she say? Hawthorne nodded as if her understanding was a foregone conclusion. "Supper is at 6. You'll find supplies in the kitchen." The previous housekeeper left instructions. The previous housekeeper. Connie did not ask what had happened to her. The town of Crawford was small enough that its entire commercial district could be traversed in 5 minutes of brisk walking. Connie had asked to visit on her third day at the ranch, citing a need for personal supplies that the ranch's stores did not contain. Hawthorne had agreed with the same indifference he showed to all her requests, providing a list of supplies he needed from the general store and permission to use the small buggy for transport. 3 days. She had spent 3 days cooking his meals, washing his clothes, scrubbing floors that had not been properly cleaned in months. Her hands were already raw from lye soap and harsh water. Her back ached from bending over washboards and cast-iron pots. She had not received a single word of thanks or acknowledgement that her labor had value. She did not need supplies. What she needed was information. She needed to understand the town, to identify potential allies, to learn whether escape was possible should escape become necessary. She needed to know if there was a telegraph office, a stagecoach line, any connection to the world beyond this dusty corner of Texas. The general store occupied the largest building on the main street, its windows displaying goods that ranged from basic necessities to small luxuries. Connie stopped the horse and buggy and tied the horse to the hitching post. She climbed down carefully, her movements still awkward after years of city streets and factory floors. Inside, the store was cool and dim, filled with the smells of coffee and leather and the indefinable scent of commerce. A woman behind the counter looked up as Connie entered, her expression shifting from welcome to something more guarded when she noticed the quality of Connie's dress, the travel wear still visible despite careful brushing. "Help you find something?" "Mr. Hawthorne sent a list." Connie produced the paper from her pocket. "And I need a few items for myself." The woman took the list and began gathering supplies without comment. Connie wandered the store's narrow aisles, noting prices and products, filing away information that might prove useful later. Thread, paper, stamps, things she might need if she ever found a way to leave. She was examining a display of writing materials when she heard the front door open and a familiar voice drift across the store. "Sarah, there you are." Hawthorne. Connie did not turn, but she positioned herself near a shelf that allowed her to see the counter reflected in the store's front window. Hawthorne had entered with a woman on his arm, a pretty woman with dark hair and a dress that was far finer than any Connie had ever owned. His hand rested on the small of her back with an intimacy that spoke of long familiarity. "Edgar, you're terrible," the woman laughed. "What will people think? Let them think what they like." Hawthorne's voice was warm now, playful, nothing like the cold formality he had shown Connie. "I've missed you, Sarah. You saw me 2 days ago. 2 days too long." Connie stood very still, the writing paper forgotten in her hands. Her stomach turned, not with surprise exactly, but with the sick recognition of a trap she should have anticipated. She understood now, with perfect clarity, what she was to Edgar Hawthorne. Not a prospective wife, not even a servant, really. She was unpaid labor, brought to Texas under false pretenses, expected to work while he continued whatever relationship he had with the woman he called Sarah. The advertisement had promised marriage. His letter had spoken of determining suitability, but those words had been lies designed to lure desperate women across 1,000 miles. The truth was simpler and uglier. He wanted a housekeeper who would cost him nothing, and he had found one in Connie Green. She thought of Harriet on the train, telling her story of the girl who had traveled west to marry a man who already had a wife. Connie was not in that exact situation, but she was close enough. She had been deceived. She had been used. And now she was trapped in a small town where no one knew her, working for a man who had no intention of keeping his implied promises. She confronted him that evening after supper had been served and the dishes cleared. The slow buggy ride from Crawford had given her time to think, to compose what she wanted to say, to steel herself for whatever response he might offer. She had rehearsed the words in her mind as she drove the buggy back to the ranch, as she unpacked the supplies, as she prepared his meal with hands that trembled with barely contained anger. The anger surprised her. She had thought herself beyond such emotions, burned out by the losses she had already endured. But seeing Hawthorne with Sarah, hearing the warmth in his voice that he had never shown her, had in some way kindled a flame she could not quite extinguish. "Mr. Hawthorne," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath, "I need to speak with you about our arrangement." He looked up from the newspaper he was reading, his expression already cooling into the careful blankness she had come to recognize. "Yes? You led me to believe we would be married. Your advertisement promised marriage upon arrival. Your letter spoke of determining suitability, but the implication was clear. The implication was yours to make, not mine to promise. I saw you today, in town, with a woman named Sarah." Something flickered in Hawthorne's eyes. Not guilt, not embarrassment, annoyance perhaps at having his private affairs witnessed by a servant he had not intended to acknowledge. "Sarah is a friend of long standing," he said carefully. "Her relationship to me is none of your concern. It is my concern if I traveled 1,000 miles expecting to become your wife, and you will become my wife." His voice hardened. "If you prove suitable, if you demonstrate the domestic capability you claimed in your letter, if you earn the position you've applied for." "I did not apply for a position. I answered a matrimonial advertisement." "You answered an advertisement for a woman of domestic capability willing to relocate to Texas. You have relocated. You are demonstrating your capability. When I am satisfied that you meet my requirements, we will proceed to the next stage." Connie's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirts to hide the tremor. "And if I refuse? If I choose to leave?" Hawthorne set down his newspaper and regarded her with the same assessing gaze he had worn at the train station. "You may leave whenever you wish, but I should remind you that I paid for your passage here. That expense represents a considerable investment on my part. Should you choose to leave before that investment has been recouped through your labor, I would be within my rights to seek compensation." "You would sue me for the cost of the train ticket?" "Myth. I would report the theft to the sheriff. A woman who takes passage under false pretenses, accepting transportation she never intended to earn through honest work, is little better than a thief." His smile was cold now, a predator's smile. "The law in these parts takes theft seriously, Miss Green, very seriously indeed. The jaws of the trap closed around her. She had no money for lawyers. She had no witnesses to the promises implied in his advertisement. She had only her word against his, and he was a landowner while she was a woman alone in a town where she knew no one. "I see," she said for the second time since arriving at this place. "I'm glad we understand each other." Hawthorne returned to his newspaper. "Breakfast is at 7. I expect eggs and biscuits. The chickens are in the coop behind the house." Connie walked back to her servant's room with measured steps, her spine straight, her face composed. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not cry or plead or show any sign of the despair that was settling into her bones. She had been a fool. She had believed in newspaper advertisements and formal letters and the hope that desperation might lead to something better. Instead, it had led here, to a narrow bed in a narrow room, to a man who saw her as labor rather than person, to a trap that closed more tightly with each passing day. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the plain walls of her prison. The window was too small for escape, even if she had somewhere to go. The door had no lock, which meant she had no privacy, no protection from Hawthorne's demands at any hour. The walls were thin enough that she could hear the house settling around her, creaking and groaning as if it too were exhausted by the weight of its own decline. She had escaped one form of servitude only to find herself in another. The factory, at least, had paid wages. Here, there would be only work and the slowly growing debt of a train ticket she could never repay. Every meal she cooked, every floor she scrubbed, every shirt she laundered would be counted against that debt, and she suspected Hawthorne would find ways to ensure the debt never diminished. The night pressed in around her. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of cattle lowing and the wind rustling through the dry grass. The Texas sky was vast overhead, filled with more stars than she had ever seen in the city, but their beauty was mockery. What good were stars to a woman who could not leave? For the first time since leaving the tenement, Connie allowed herself to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. She had traded one cage for another, and this cage was larger but no less confining. The bars were made of distance and debt, and the careful threats of a man who knew exactly how to trap a woman with no resources. But wondering changed nothing. Mistakes, once made, could only be endured. She would endure this too, somehow, as she had endured everything else. She lay down on the narrow bed and did not sleep. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to her suffering, and the Texas night stretched on forever. Chapter 6. The pump behind the kitchen was broken. Connie discovered this on her fourth morning at the ranch, when the handle came off in her hands and water spurted uselessly across the wooden platform. She stood there for a moment, holding the rusted iron handle, watching the water soak into her dress and pool around her feet. Another problem, another thing that would be her fault somehow when Hawthorne discovered it. She was examining the mechanism, trying to understand how the handle might be reattached, when a voice spoke from behind her. "Needs a new pin." Connie turned to find a man standing several yards away, near the corner of the barn. He was lean and weathered, with the kind of build that came from years of physical labor rather than any attempt at cultivation. His clothing was plain and worn but clean, and his face bore the lines of someone who spent his days in sun and wind. He held a coil of rope in one hand and a bridle in the other, clearly on his way to some task of his own. "I beg your pardon?" "The pin that holds the handle to the shaft. It's rusted through." He set down the rope and bridle and walked toward her, his movements unhurried but purposeful. "Been meaning to fix it, but Mr. Hawthorne keeps me busy elsewhere." Connie stepped back as he approached, uncertain how to respond. She had seen men around the property during her first days, distant figures working in the fields or tending to cattle, but she had not spoken to any of them. Hawthorne had not introduced her, and she had assumed the ranch hands were not meant to concern her. "You're the new housekeeper," the man said. It was not a question. "Caleb Turner. I work the cattle mostly, but I handle repairs when they're needed." Constance Green. The name sounded strange on her tongue, too formal for this place, where formality seemed like a costume no one bothered to wear. Connie. Caleb nodded as if the information was sufficient and turned his attention to the pump. His hands moved with practiced certainty as he examined the mechanism, testing connections and inspecting the damage. Connie watched in silence, acutely aware of her wet dress and the water still dripping from the platform. "I can have it fixed by this afternoon," he said finally. "There's a spare pin in the barn that should fit. In the meantime, there's a well on the east side of the house. Older, but it works. Thank you." He straightened and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were a pale gray, watchful without being aggressive, the eyes of someone who had learned to observe before speaking. Whatever he saw in her face made him nod again, as if confirming something he had suspected. "You'll want to tell Mr. Hawthorne about the well," he said. "He doesn't like surprises." "I will." Caleb retrieved his rope and bridle and walked away without further conversation. Connie watched him go, this man who had offered help without expectation and information without condescension. It was the first kindness she had received since arriving in Texas. She did not know what to make of it. True to his word, Caleb fixed the pump that afternoon. Connie discovered this when she went to test the mechanism and found it working smoothly, the handle secure, the water flowing clear and cold. There was no note, no announcement, no request for thanks. The repair had simply been made, quietly and efficiently, as if it were the natural order of things. She stood for a moment with her hand on the pump handle, feeling the smoothness of its motion, the reliability of its function. Such a small thing. A broken pump, a missing pin, a few minutes of labor. In her former life, she would not have noticed such repairs. Someone else would have handled them, and she would have continued with her day, never aware of the work that kept the world running. But she was aware now. She had been made aware by months of factory labor, by weeks of tenement living, by the knowledge that nothing in her life was maintained by invisible hands. Everything required effort. Everything required someone to care enough to make it work. She found herself watching for him in the days that followed, not with any particular intention, but with a growing curiosity about this man who moved through the ranch like a ghost, present everywhere but noticed by no one. He anticipated problems before they became crises, fixing a loose hinge on the henhouse door, replacing a worn rope on the well bucket, and mending a section of fence that had been threatening to collapse for weeks. Hawthorne never mentioned these repairs. Connie suspected he did not know about most of them, or if he did, he assumed they had happened by some natural process that required no acknowledgement. The ranch existed, therefore the ranch maintained itself. The labor that made this possible was invisible to him, but it was not invisible to Connie. On her second week at the ranch, she was carrying water from the well to the kitchen when she saw Caleb near the barn, examining one of the horses with a concentration that suggested something was wrong. She set down her buckets and walked toward him, not entirely sure why. "Is the horse all right?" Caleb looked up, surprised by her approach, but not unwelcoming. "Stone bruise. She'll be fine in a few days if she's rested properly." "Will Mr. Hawthorne allow that?" The question seemed to amuse him, though his expression barely changed. "Mr. Hawthorne doesn't notice much about the horses as long as they're there when he wants them. I'll tell him she's got a mild cough. He won't want to catch it." Connie found herself almost smiling. It was the first time in weeks that anything close to amusement had surfaced. "That seems like a useful strategy. It's how things work around here." Caleb turned back to the horse, running his hand gently along her leg. "You learn what he pays attention to and what he doesn't. Most things fall into the second category, including the household repairs, including most things." He glanced at her again, measuring. "You've been here 2 weeks now, long enough to know this isn't what you expected." It was not a question, but it demanded a response nonetheless. Connie considered her options. She could deny it, maintain the fiction that she was satisfied with her situation. She could deflect, change the subject, retreat to the kitchen, and the endless tasks that awaited her there. Instead, she told the truth. "I expected to be married. I expected honesty, at least, if not affection." Her voice was steady despite the bitterness beneath. "I did not expect to be a servant paying off a debt I never agreed to." Caleb nodded slowly. "The last woman left after 3 months. The one before that lasted 6 weeks. They all come thinking the same thing, and they all leave when they figure out the truth." How do they leave? I have no money for passage back east. Different ways. Some find relatives to wire money. Some find men in town willing to marry them properly. Some just walk away and take their chances. He paused, his hand still on the horse's leg. A few give up trying to leave at all. The words settled into Connie's chest like stones. She had considered these possibilities in the dark hours of sleepless nights, turning them over and over without finding any that seemed viable. No relatives would help her. No men in town knew she existed, and walking away with nothing meant risking something worse than what she already had. You've been here longer than 3 months, she said, going on 4 years. Why do you stay? Caleb straightened, his expression closing slightly. Same reason you do. No money, no references, nowhere certain to go. At least here I get fed and have a roof over my head. That's more than a lot of men can say. But you work without proper wages. I've seen how much you do, and I've seen how little you receive for it. I receive enough to survive. Sometimes that's all that matters. He picked up the horse's lead and began walking her toward the paddock. Get back to your work, Miss Green. He'll notice if you're gone too long. It was a dismissal, gentle but firm. Connie watched him go, this man who had answered her questions with honesty and asked nothing in return. He understood her situation because he lived his own version of it. They were both trapped by the same man, bound by the same invisible chains of poverty and circumstance. But at least, she thought, she was not entirely alone anymore. The scene in the yard happened on a Thursday. Connie was beating rugs on the porch, sending clouds of dust into the dry Texas air, when she heard Hawthorne's voice rise in anger from the direction of the barn. The words were muffled by distance, but the tone was unmistakable. Sharp, cutting. The voice of a man who enjoyed exercising power over those who could not fight back. She moved to the edge of the porch, drawn by a curiosity she knew she should suppress. From there she could see the barnyard clearly, could see Hawthorne standing with his arms crossed and his face twisted with contempt, could see Caleb standing before him with his head slightly bowed and his hands loose at his sides. I asked you a simple question, Turner. Where were you yesterday afternoon when I needed the wagon hitched? Fixing the south fence, sir. The cattle were getting through. Did I tell you to fix the south fence? No, sir. But if the cattle... I don't pay you to think. Hawthorne's voice cracked like a whip. I pay you to do what you're told, when you're told, and nothing else. You think that because you've been here a few years, that gives you the right to make decisions? You're a hired hand. You're nothing. Remember that. Caleb said nothing. He stood with his head bowed and his body still, absorbing the abuse without reaction. Connie had seen this posture before, in the factory, in the tenement, in all the places where powerless people learned to survive by making themselves small. It was the posture of endurance, the posture of someone who knew that fighting back would only make things worse. Look at me when I'm speaking to you. Caleb raised his head. His face was blank, carefully empty of the anger that must have been churning beneath the surface. Yes, sir. The next time you decide to take initiative, you'll find yourself looking for work elsewhere. And don't think any rancher in this county will hire you without a reference from me. You understand? Yes, sir. 4 years you've worked here, and you still haven't learned your place. Hawthorne's voice dripped with contempt. Maybe I should start docking your wages for every time you step out of line. Would that help you remember who's in charge around here? Caleb remained silent. There was nothing he could say that would help, and they both knew it. Any response would be taken as insubordination, and any defense would be twisted into an attack. The only safe choice was to stand there and absorb the abuse until Hawthorne tired of delivering it. Hawthorne turned and walked away, his posture stiff with satisfaction. He did not notice Connie standing on the porch. He did not notice anything that did not concern his immediate comfort. Caleb remained where he was for a long moment, his hands slowly clenching and unclenching at his sides. Then he picked up the tools he had set down when Hawthorne approached and walked back toward the barn, his movements careful and controlled. Connie returned to her rugs with a new weight in her chest. She understood now, more clearly than before, what this place was. It was not a ranch. It was a trap. designed to capture vulnerable people and extract labor from them without fair compensation. Hawthorne was not a poor manager or a difficult employer. He was a man who had built his entire existence on the exploitation of those who had no power to fight back. She had known this from the moment she arrived, but seeing it confirmed, seeing another person subjected to the same dismissive cruelty she had experienced, made it real in a way that her own suffering had not. She and Caleb Turner were both prisoners here. The only difference was the length of their sentences. That evening, after supper had been served and the dishes cleared, Connie found herself on the back porch with a cup of cold water and the first quiet moment she'd experienced all day. The sun was setting over the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have seemed beautiful in different circumstances. Here, they simply marked the end of another exhausting day. She did not hear Caleb approach until he was nearly beside her. "Mind if I sit?" Connie moved over on the narrow step, making room. He settled beside her with the careful grace of someone whose body was permanently tired, his own cup of water in his hand. For a long moment, neither spoke. The evening settled around them, crickets beginning their chorus in the dry grass, the distant lowing of cattle drifting from the fields. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," Caleb said finally. "With Mr. Hawthorne. It was not the first time I've seen a man berate someone with less power." Connie kept her voice neutral. "It will not be the last." "No, it won't." He took a sip of his water. "You get used to it. That's the worst part. You get used to it, and then you start to think it's normal, and then you forget there's any other way to live." "How long before that happens?" "Depends on the person. Some folks break quickly, some hold on longer." He glanced at her, his gray eyes catching the fading light. "You strike me as the holding on type. I don't have much choice." "Nobody does, really. We just tell ourselves we're making choices because the alternative is admitting we're trapped." The honesty was startling, more direct than anything she had heard from anyone since leaving the East. People in her world, her former world, spoke in careful euphemisms. They avoided unpleasant truths. They pretended circumstances were choices and helplessness was character. Caleb Turner did none of these things. He simply said what was true and expected her to handle it. "Why are you talking to me?" The question came out more sharply than she intended. "The others here avoid me. They know what I am, what I was supposed to be, what I've become instead. But you keep fixing things and answering questions and sitting beside me on porches." "Maybe I'm tired of being alone." He said it simply, without self-pity. 4 years is a long time to have no one to talk to honestly. The other hands come and go. The housekeepers come and go faster. You're the first one who seems like she might actually understand. Understand what? What it's like to have no good choices and make the best one anyway. What it's like to work without hope of reward. What it's like to be treated as something less than human by someone who needs your labor to survive, but refuses to acknowledge your worth. Connie looked out at the darkening hills. The stars were emerging now, faint points of light in a vast indifferent sky. She thought about the factory, where her labor had been bought and sold by the hour. She thought about the train, carrying her toward a future she could not imagine. She thought about this man beside her, who had spent 4 years in a trap she had only just entered. "We're both trapped," she said, "but at least we're not alone in it." "No," Caleb's voice was quiet. "We're not." They sat together on the porch until full darkness fell, two people who had found in each other the first glimmer of something that might, in other circumstances, be called understanding. It was not friendship, not yet. It was not love, not anything close to that. It was simply the recognition that they were both fighting the same battle, and that battle was easier with an ally. When Connie finally rose to go inside, Caleb rose with her. "I'll fix the crack in your bedroom window tomorrow," he said. "The night cold is getting worse, and that gap lets in more draft than you'd think." "You don't have to do that." "I know." His smile was faint, barely visible in the darkness. "That's why I'm going to." He walked away toward the bunkhouse, and Connie went inside to her narrow bed in her narrow room. But for the first time since arriving in Texas, she did not feel entirely hopeless. Small kindnesses, small acts of recognition, small moments of human connection in a place designed to strip all of that away. It was not much, but it was something, and she was learning how something was infinitely better than nothing at all. Chapter 7. The evenings became their time, not by arrangement, not by spoken agreement, but by the simple rhythm of work that brought them to the same places at the same hours. Connie would finish the supper dishes and slip out onto the back porch to escape the oppressive silence of the house. The kitchen would still be warm from the stove, the dishes still dripping on their rack, and she would carry her exhaustion out into the cooling air like a weight she could finally set down. Caleb would return from the barn, having seen to the horses and checked the fences one last time before dark. His boots would be dusty, his shirt damp with sweat, his movements slow with the accumulated fatigue of another endless day. But he would see her on the porch and change direction, walking toward her instead of toward the bunkhouse where he slept. They would find each other there in the fading light, and the conversation would begin. It started with small talk. The weather, which was always either too hot or threatening rain that never came. The condition of the livestock, which required constant attention that Hawthorne refused to provide. The endless list of repairs that needed attention and never received it, accumulating like debts that would eventually come due. Safe topics, neutral ground, the kind of talk that could be overheard without consequence. But even this small connection was precious. Even this brief respite from isolation made the days more bearable. And gradually, over the course of weeks, the talk grew deeper. "What did you want to be?" Connie asked one evening, when the stars were just beginning to emerge and the heat of the day had finally released its grip on the land. "Before all this, before you ended up here." Caleb was silent for a long moment, his profile sharp against the darkening sky. "I don't know that I ever wanted to be anything in particular. I was an orphan. Growing up, I just wanted to survive long enough to become a man. After that, I figured I'd work until I couldn't work anymore, and then I'd die. That was the extent of my planning." "That's terribly bleak. It's honest." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes catching the last of the light. "I learned early that hoping for things just made it worse when they didn't happen. Better to expect nothing and be surprised by anything good." Connie understood that philosophy. She had lived it herself, in the months after the fire, in the grinding sameness of factory work and tenement living. Expectation was a luxury for people with security. For people like them, it was a dangerous indulgence. "I was supposed to marry a man named Robert Smith," she said quietly. "Our families had arranged it years before. Not formally, but everyone understood. We would marry, and I would keep his house, and we would have children who would grow up to do the same things we had done. It was all planned out, every step of the way." "What happened?" "He died. A fever, they said. One week he was healthy, and the next week he was gone." Her voice was steady, but the memory still carried weight. "I was not in love with him, you understand. I'm not sure I even liked him particularly. But he was my future, the only future I knew how to imagine. When he died, it was like watching a door close that I had always assumed would be open." She paused, gathering the words that came next. She had not spoken of this to anyone since leaving the East. The telling was strange, like pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurt. "And then my parents died in a fire while I was running an errand. I was at the market, buying thread for my mother, when I saw the smoke rising from the direction of our street. By the time I reached the house, there was nothing left. Nothing but ashes and neighbors standing around with their hands in their pockets, offering pity but no solutions." "I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago now. Months at least. Though sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like it happened to someone else entirely." She shook her head slowly. "I lost everything in the same month. The future I was supposed to have, the family I was supposed to rely on, the security I had always taken for granted, all of it gone." Caleb said nothing, but his silence was attentive rather than dismissive. He was listening, really listening, in a way that Connie had not experienced since arriving in Texas. "I answered the advertisement because I had no other options," she continued. "Not because I hoped for love or romance or any of the things that respectable women are supposed to want from marriage. I answered it because I was desperate, and it seemed like the least terrible choice available to me. And you got this instead. Yes, she looked out at the darkening hills. I got this instead. They sat in silence for a while, the crickets filling the space between them with their endless song. The night pressed in around them, intimate and vast at the same time. I don't stay here because I'm loyal, Caleb said finally. I want you to understand that. I stay because I don't know where else to go. The other ranches in this county won't hire without references, and Hawthorne knows that. He knows exactly what he has over me. But you've been here 4 years. You must have saved something in that time. Some. Not enough to start over properly. Not enough to risk losing everything on a gamble that might not pay off. He shook his head slowly. I tell myself I'm waiting for the right moment, for something to change. But the truth is, I'm afraid. Afraid that out there is worse than in here. Afraid that the devil I know is better than the one I don't. The admission cost him something. Connie could see that. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched on his knees. He was not a man accustomed to revealing weakness, and the revelation made him uncomfortable. I'm afraid too, she said. I'm afraid all the time, afraid of what Hawthorne might demand next, afraid of what will happen if I refuse, afraid of the winter coming and having nowhere to go if he decides I'm no longer useful. At least we're afraid together. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Together. Such a small word, but it contained something that neither of them had experienced in a very long time. The knowledge that someone else understood, that someone else was fighting the same battle. Connie did not reach for his hand. She did not move closer to him on the narrow porch step. That kind of intimacy was not available to them. Not here, not now. But something shifted between them nonetheless. A connection that was neither romantic nor merely practical, but something in between. Something that made the endless days more bearable. The change in Hawthorne's behavior began gradually, so gradually that Connie almost did not notice it at first. A sharpness in his tone when he spoke to her. A tendency to find fault with tasks that had been acceptable the day before. A cold assessment in his eyes when he looked at her, as if he were calculating something she could not quite identify. The first real incident came on a Tuesday afternoon. Connie was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Hawthorne appeared, his expression already twisted with displeasure. "Those sheets are wrinkled," he said without preamble. "What's the point of washing them if you can't even hang them properly?" Connie looked at the sheets. They were hung exactly as she had been hanging them for weeks, with the same care and attention she brought to all her tasks. There were no wrinkles that she could see. "I apologize, Mr. Hawthorne. I'll be more careful." "You'll be more careful." His voice dripped with mockery. "That's what you always say. I'll be more careful. I'll try harder. I'm sorry, but nothing ever changes, does it? The work is still sloppy. The house is still dusty. The food is still barely edible." The accusations were false, and they both knew it. Connie kept the house cleaner than it had been in years. She cooked meals that were simple but nourishing. She worked from before dawn until after dark, with barely a moment's rest. But the truth did not matter to Hawthorne. What mattered was his need to assert dominance, to remind her of her place, to make her feel small. "I'm doing my best, sir." "Your best isn't good enough." He stepped closer, his eyes narrow. "Maybe I made a mistake bringing you here. Maybe I should have found someone who actually knows how to work, someone grateful for the opportunity instead of someone who acts like she's doing me a favor by existing." Connie said nothing. There was nothing to say that would help. Any defense would be taken as insubordination. Any apology would be taken as a weakness. She simply stood there, her hands full of wet linens, and waited for him to finish. "I've been too lenient with you," Hawthorne continued. "Too patient. That's going to change. From now on, I expect perfection, nothing less. And if you can't provide it, you'll find yourself on the street with nothing but the clothes on your back. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "And stay away from Turner." The words came suddenly, sharp and unexpected. "I've seen you talking on the porch in the evenings. I don't pay either of you to socialize. Whatever you think is happening between you, put it out of your mind. You're here to work, not to make friends." The accusation stung. not because it was true in the way Hawthorne imagined, but because it revealed how closely he was watching, how little privacy they had, how precarious their small moments of connection truly were. "There's nothing improper, sir. We only talk. I don't care what you call it. It stops now. Both of you have too much work to do to waste time on conversation." His eyes narrowed. "Unless you'd prefer to find out what happens to women who don't know their place in this household." The threat was clear, even if its specifics remained vague. A chill ran through her, despite the heat of the afternoon. This was not merely about laundry or household standards. This was about control, about breaking her spirit, about ensuring she remained compliant and isolated. He turned and walked away, leaving Connie standing in the yard with her heart pounding and her hands trembling. The sheets flapped in the breeze, perfectly hung, perfectly innocent of the crime they had been accused of. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears accomplished nothing and could be used against you. But something inside her hardened a little more, another layer of protection against a world that seemed determined to break her. That evening, Caleb found her on the porch earlier than usual. She was sitting with her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, her body still and tense. "I heard," he said quietly, settling beside her. "The other hands were talking about it, said Hawthorne was in a rage all afternoon. He accused me of hanging the laundry wrong, the same way I've been hanging it for weeks." Her voice was flat, drained of emotion. "He threatened to throw me out if I can't provide perfection. He won't do it. He needs you too much." "Does he? I'm beginning to wonder." She turned to look at him. What happens when his temper outweighs his need for cheap labor? What happens when he decides I'm more trouble than I'm worth? Then you leave. You find another way. With what? "I have nothing, Caleb. No money, no references, no connections. If he throws me out, I'm finished. I'll end up on the streets or worse." The desperation in her voice was raw, unguarded in a way she had not allowed herself to be before. The careful composure she maintained during the day had cracked, and underneath it was nothing but fear. Caleb was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful. "There might be another option, something I've been thinking about for a while now." "What kind of option?" "Leaving, both of us, together." The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling. Connie's heart began to beat faster, but she forced herself to think rather than react. "Leaving with what? You said yourself you don't have enough saved to start over." "I have some, more than I've let Hawthorne know about, and there's a ranch about 50 miles west of here, the Boone place. I've heard they treat their hands fairly, pay actual wages, don't ask too many questions about where a man came from." "And what would I do?" "I can't exactly ride along as a ranch hand." "You could work there, too. They have a proper household, with a cook and a housekeeper and all that. Mrs. Boone is known for taking in women who need a fresh start." He paused, his gray eyes searching her face. "It wouldn't be easy. We'd be starting over with nothing, but at least we'd be free." Free. The word tasted strange on Connie's tongue, unfamiliar after so many months of captivity in one form or another. Free from the factory, free from Hawthorne, free from the endless cycle of exploitation and survival that had defined her existence since the fire. "Why would you take me with you?" she asked. "You barely know me. We've only been talking for a few weeks. Because you're the only person here who understands. Because I'm tired of being alone. Because we're both trapped in the same cage, and it seems like we might have a better chance of escape together than apart." His honesty was disarming. There was no romantic declaration, no pretense that his motives were purely selfless. He was offering a practical alliance, a partnership of necessity, and he was being clear about what it was and what it was not. "We would be taking a terrible risk," Connie said slowly. "If we fail, if the Boone place doesn't work out, we'll have nothing. We have nothing now. At least out there, we'd have a chance." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had become her ally through circumstance rather than choice. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face was weathered, his hands rough, his clothing worn, but there was steadiness in him, a quiet strength that she had come to rely on without realizing it. She had not expected to find kindness in Texas. She had not expected to find understanding or companionship or anything resembling friendship. She had come here expecting to survive, to endure, to make the best of a bad situation until she found something better. Instead, she had found Caleb Turner, who asked nothing of her except honesty and offered the same in return. It was not love. She was not foolish enough to call it that, but it was something. It was valuable. It was worth protecting. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Take your time. We can't leave until I've gathered a few more things anyway, but don't take too long. Hawthorne's getting worse, and I don't know how much longer either of us can hold out." He rose and walked toward the bunkhouse, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the vast Texas sky. The stars were out in force now, thousands of them scattered across the darkness, indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath them. Escape, freedom. The words circled in her mind, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. She had been running from disaster since the fire, always reacting, never choosing. But this would be different. This would be a choice, a deliberate step into uncertainty, a gamble that might save her or destroy her. She thought about Hawthorne's increasing hostility, his threats, his cold eyes assessing her worth. She thought about the months ahead, the winter coming, the certainty that things would get worse before they got better. She thought about the factory, the tenement, all the places where she had endured rather than lived. And she thought about Caleb, standing beside her on the porch, offering his hand without demanding anything in return. The decision would not be made tonight, but something inside her had shifted, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would not stay here forever. One way or another, she would find a way out. The only question was whether she would find it in time. Chapter 8. The guests arrived on a Saturday afternoon, 3 men in expensive suits who dismounted from equally expensive horses and walked toward the house as if they owned it. Connie watched them through the kitchen window, her hands still wet from the dishes, her stomach already tightening with unease. There was something in the way they carried themselves, an arrogance, a sense of entitlement that radiated from their posture, their expensive clothing, and the casual way they handed their reins to the ranch hand who had appeared to take their horses. These were not ordinary businessmen making a social call. These were men who expected to be served, to be entertained, to receive whatever they demanded. Hawthorne had not warned her of their arrival. He had simply appeared that morning with a list of demands: the finest linens, the best china, a meal worthy of important visitors. No explanation of who these men were or why they were coming. Just orders, delivered in the clipped tone that had become his standard method of communication. She had asked no questions. She had learned by now that questions only invited trouble, only gave Hawthorne another opportunity to remind her of her place and her debts. Better to comply silently and hope the day would pass without incident. She had done her best. The house was as clean as she could make it with the supplies available. The meal was simple but respectable, roasted chicken and vegetables from the small garden she had been tending. The table was set with the chipped china that passed for fine dishes in this household. It would not be enough. She knew that before the guests even entered the house. Nothing she did was ever enough for Edgar Hawthorne. The men settled into the parlor with whiskey and cigars while Connie served the meal. She kept her eyes down and her movements efficient, trying to be invisible, trying to complete her duties and escape to the kitchen before anyone noticed her presence. But Hawthorne noticed. Hawthorne always noticed. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Miss Green." His voice cut through the conversation, forcing her to stop mid-retreat. "She came all the way from the east to help me manage this household. Quite a journey, wouldn't you say?" The men looked at her with expressions that made her skin crawl. Assessing, appraising, the kind of looks she had seen directed at livestock at auction or at women standing on certain street corners. "A pleasure, Miss Green," said the oldest of the 3, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and small, calculating eyes. "Edgar speaks highly of your domestic capabilities." There was a certain tone in the way he said it, a weight on the word domestic that suggested capabilities of a different sort entirely. Connie's hands tightened on the serving tray. "Thank you, sir. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on the dessert." Nonsense. Hawthorne's hand closed around her arm, his grip firm but not quite painful. Stay and visit with our guests. They've traveled a long way and they'd appreciate some company. The request was not a request. Connie recognized that immediately. She recognized, too, what was being asked of her. To sit with these men, to smile and nod and laugh at their jokes, to be pleasant company in whatever way they required. I'm afraid I'm not properly dressed for company, Mr. Hawthorne. Perhaps after I've finished in the kitchen. You're dressed well enough. His grip tightened slightly. Sit down, Miss Green. That's an order. She could feel the guests watching, waiting to see how she would respond. She could feel Hawthorne's fingers pressing into her arm, a warning and a threat wrapped in a single touch. She could feel the walls of the trap closing in around her. But she could not do this. Whatever else she had sacrificed to survive, she could not sacrifice this. No. The word came out quietly, but clearly. Hawthorne's face went blank with surprise, then dark with fury. What did you say? I said no. Connie met his eyes directly, her voice steady despite the terror churning in her stomach. I am here to cook and clean and manage your household. I am not here to entertain your guests. That was not part of our arrangement. The silence that followed was absolute. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them coughed. Another reached for his whiskey glass as if seeking something to do with his hands. Hawthorne's face had gone a dangerous shade of red. His grip on her arm tightened to the point of pain. You will do as you're told, he said, his voice low and venomous, or you will face the consequences. Then I will face the consequences. She pulled her arm free of his grasp and walked out of the room, her spine straight, her head high. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her temples, in her fingertips. Every step was like walking on broken glass, every breath like swallowing fire. She had done the unthinkable. She had said no to a man who believed he owned her. Behind her, she could hear Hawthorne making excuses, explaining away her behavior with words like tired and overwhelmed and city women. She's not used to the frontier ways yet, he was saying, his voice tight with barely concealed fury. You know how delicate these Eastern girls can be. I assure you, she'll be more accommodating in the future. The guests laughed uncomfortably, the way men laugh when they sense tension and want to pretend it does not exist. The conversation resumed, the clink of glasses and the rumble of masculine voices carrying through the thin walls. The moment passed, but Connie knew with absolute certainty that the moment was not over. It was only beginning. She had challenged Hawthorne's authority in front of witnesses. She had made him look weak, foolish, unable to command obedience from a woman he claimed to control. He would not forgive that. He would not forget. The confrontation came after the guests had departed, their horses carrying them away into the darkness, while Connie cleaned the dishes and tried to ignore the storm she knew was brewing. The waiting was almost worse than the confrontation itself. Each minute that passed was another minute of anticipation, another minute of her imagination conjuring the various punishments Hawthorne might devise. She scrubbed the pots with unnecessary force, her hands red and raw from the hot water, her body tense with the expectation of violence. She thought about running, right then, before he came for her. She could slip out the back door and disappear into the darkness. But she had nowhere to go, no plan, no resources. Running blindly would only make matters worse. So she waited, and she cleaned, and she tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. Hawthorne found her in the kitchen. His footsteps were heavy on the floorboards, his breathing audible before he even appeared in the doorway. She heard him coming and forced herself to continue working, to show no sign of the fear that was clawing at her insides. When she turned to face him, his expression was calm. That was the worst part, the cold, measured calm of a man who had moved past anger into what was more calculated. Anger could be weathered. Anger burned hot and fast and then subsided. But this calculated coldness was something else entirely. Do you have any idea, he said slowly, what you've done? I refused an order that was improper and degrading. You embarrassed me in front of important business associates. You humiliated me in my own home. You made me look like a fool who can't control his own household. I am not yours to control. The slap came so quickly she did not see it coming. One moment she was standing, the next she was stumbling against the counter, her cheek burning, her ears ringing from the impact. She caught herself before she fell, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. "You forget your place." Hawthorne's voice was still calm, almost conversational. "You came here with nothing. You owe me for your passage, for your room, for every meal you've eaten since arriving. You are mine until that debt is paid, and it will never be paid because I decide when it's paid. Do you understand?" Connie said nothing. Her cheek throbbed, her hands shook, but she did not answer. "If you ever refuse an order again, I will put you on the street with nothing but the clothes on your back, no money, no references, no way to find honest work in any town in this county. Do you know what happens to women like you when that occurs? Do you know where they end up?" She knew. She had seen such women in the city, hollow-eyed and desperate, selling the only thing they had left to sell. The threat was not empty. Hawthorne was capable of carrying it out, and he would enjoy watching her fall. "You have one more chance," he continued. "One more opportunity to prove your value, tomorrow when I have more guests." "No." The word came from the doorway, not from Connie's lips. Both she and Hawthorne turned to find Caleb standing there, his frame filling the doorway, his expression harder than she had ever seen it. "Stay out of this, Turner." Hawthorne's voice dripped with contempt. "This is between me and my housekeeper. You hit her." Caleb's voice was steady, but there was a dangerous undercurrent beneath the calm. "I saw it through the window. You struck her. And what if I did? She's in my household, on my property. What happens between us is none of your concern. It's my concern when I see a man strike a woman." Caleb stepped into the kitchen, his movements slow and deliberate. "That's not something I can walk away from." "Then you're a fool." Hawthorne turned to face him fully, his shoulders squared, his chin raised. "A fool who just talked himself out of a job. Get off my property, Turner. You're finished here." "Fine." Caleb did not flinch. "I'll collect my things and be gone by morning." "You'll be gone now, this instant, without your things, without your wages, without anything but what you're wearing. That's the price of interfering in matters that don't concern you." Connie found her voice at last. "Mr. Hawthorne, please. He was only trying to—" "Silence." The word cracked like a whip. "You've caused enough trouble for one night. Get to your room and stay there until I decide what to do with you." Caleb's eyes met hers across the kitchen. There was something in his gaze, a message she could not quite read but understood nonetheless. A promise, a plan, a silent communication that said this is not over, even as it appeared to be exactly that. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll be all right." There was something in his voice, in his eyes, that she did not fully understand. A determination, a decision already made. But there was no time to ask questions, no opportunity to understand what he meant. Hawthorne was advancing, his face twisted with fury, and she needed to be gone before she became the target once more. Connie went. She walked past Hawthorne without looking at him, down the dark hallway to her narrow room. Her footsteps echoed on the floorboards, each one carrying her further from the confrontation but no closer to safety. Behind her, she could hear the two men's voices rising and falling, Hawthorne's sharp with rage, Caleb's steady and calm. She could not make out the words, only the tone. Hawthorne demanding, threatening, using every weapon in his arsenal of cruelty. Caleb refusing to yield, refusing to apologize, refusing to give Hawthorne the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Then the sound of the back door slamming and silence. A silence like the aftermath of an explosion, like the stillness that follows when everything has already been destroyed. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling, the wind moving across the Texas plains, the distant howl of coyotes in the darkness. Her cheek still throbbed where Hawthorne had struck her, a constant reminder of what had happened and what might happen next. Caleb was gone, sent away because he had tried to protect her. She did not know where he would go or what would become of him. She only knew that she had lost the one ally she had in this place, the one person who had treated her with kindness and respect. Tomorrow, Hawthorne would have more guests. Tomorrow, he would expect her to do what she had refused to do tonight. Tomorrow, the trap would close completely, leaving her with no options but submission or destruction, unless she refused to be there tomorrow. The thought crystallized slowly, taking shape in the darkness like a figure emerging from fog. She could leave. She could pack what little she owned and walk away from this house, this ranch, this entire nightmare of exploitation and abuse. She could find Caleb, wherever he was. They could go to the Boone Ranch together, just as he had suggested. It was madness. She had no money, no transportation, no idea how to find her way across 50 miles of Texas wilderness. She would be risking everything on a gamble that might not pay off. But what did she have to lose? Her safety was already gone, stripped away by Hawthorne's violence. Her dignity was already compromised, damaged by weeks of degradation and false promises. Her future here held nothing but more of the same, escalating demands and increasing cruelty until she was broken or destroyed. All that was left for her was her choice, the ability to decide for herself what she would do and where she would go and who she would become. She thought about her mother, who had accepted the life chosen for her without complaint. She thought about the women in the factory, grinding out their days until their bodies gave out. She thought about the other mail-order brides on the train, traveling toward futures they could not imagine, hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. She no longer wanted to be like them. She did not want to endure. She wanted to act. The decision, once made, brought a strange peace. The fear was still there, coiled in her stomach like a living thing. But alongside the fear was something else, something that might have been hope or determination, or simply the fierce refusal to accept what Hawthorne intended for her. She would leave tomorrow, before dawn, before anyone was awake, before Hawthorne could carry out his threats or his guests could return. She would find Caleb, somehow, and together they would make their way to the Boone Ranch and whatever waited there. She began to plan, her mind working through the details with a clarity that surprised her. She would need to pack only what she could carry. She would need to move silently through the house, avoiding the floorboards that creaked, avoiding the windows that faced the bunkhouse. She would need to find her way in the darkness, to the place where Caleb might be waiting, if he was waiting at all. It might be better, it might be worse, but it would be chosen, and that made all the difference. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she would be making a decision rather than accepting one that had been made for her. She would be shaping her own future rather than enduring one imposed upon her. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute lasting an hour, each hour lasting a lifetime. She lay perfectly still, listening for any sound that might indicate danger, any footstep in the hallway, any creak of the floorboards outside her door. Hawthorne might decide to come for her in the night. He might decide to finish what he had started, to punish her more thoroughly for her defiance. She would not sleep until she was free of this place. When the first gray light of dawn began to seep through her window, she rose silently and began to gather her possessions, her carpet bag, her one spare dress, the small sewing kit that had belonged to her mother, the $8 she had hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the corner of the room. $8 and the clothes on her back. It was not much with which to start a new life, but it was more than nothing, and she had learned in the months since the fire that more than nothing was often enough. Connie lay in the darkness and waited for morning, her bruised cheek pressed against the cool pillow, her mind already racing ahead to what came next. She did not know if she would succeed. She did not know if she would survive. She only knew that she would try, and for the first time since arriving in Texas, trying was enough. Chapter 9. The darkness was still intense when Connie rose from her bed. She had not slept, not really. Lying in the darkness for hours with her eyes open and her mind racing through the details of what she was about to do, every creak of the house had made her heart jump. Every distant sound had sent her imagination spiraling into scenarios of discovery and punishment. But now the time for waiting was over. The time for action had arrived. She dressed quickly, silently, her fingers finding the familiar buttons of her dress without needing light to guide them. The room was cold, the last embers of the stove having died hours ago, and she shivered as she pulled her shawl around her shoulders. But the cold was a small hindrance that could be endured. Her carpet bag sat by the door, already packed with the little she intended to take. One spare dress, her sewing kit, the small leather case that had belonged to her mother, a hairbrush, a comb, a tiny bottle of lavender water that she had kept since leaving the East, a luxury she could not afford to replace nor bear to leave behind. The $8 she had hidden beneath the floorboards, now tucked into the pocket of her dress, where she could feel their presence against her thigh. It was not much. It was everything she had. She stood in the doorway of her small room and looked around one last time. The narrow bed with its thin mattress, the washstand with its chipped basin, the single hook on the wall where her coat hung. She had never been happy here. She had never been safe or welcome or at home. But leaving was still an ending, a door closing behind her that could never be opened again. Good, she thought. Let it close. The hallway was dark and silent. Hawthorne's bedroom was at the far end of the house, separated from her room by the parlor and the kitchen. She would need to pass through both to reach the back door. But if she was careful, if she moved slowly and quietly, she could make it without waking him. She pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself and began to walk. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, despite her best efforts. Every sound seemed magnified in the silence. Every step a potential betrayal. She paused after each creak, holding her breath, listening for any sign that Hawthorne had awakened. But the house remained still. The silence held. The kitchen was the hardest section to breach. The door to the back porch squeaked on its hinges, a sound she had heard 100 times during her weeks of domestic labor. She had never thought to oil it, never imagined she would need to escape through it in the darkness. Now she eased it open, inch by inch, gritting her teeth at each complaint of the metal until the gap was wide enough for her to slip through. The night air hit her face like a splash of cold water. The stars were brilliant overhead, more stars than she had ever seen in the city, scattered across the vast Texas sky like diamonds on black velvet. The prairie stretched away in all directions, invisible in the darkness but present nonetheless, a vast emptiness waiting to swallow her. She had never been so small. She had never been so free. Caleb was waiting at the edge of the property, just beyond the fence that marked the boundary of Hawthorne's land. He had a horse with him, a mare she recognized from the barn, and another horse tied beside it. 2 horses, enough for the 2 of them. She had not been entirely sure he would be there. After what had happened, after Hawthorne had dismissed him and sent him away, there was no reason for him to wait. He could have left on his own, taken his chances alone, found his way to the Boone Ranch or anywhere else without the burden of an inexperienced city woman slowing him down. But he had waited. He had come back for her. "You came," he said as she approached, his face barely visible in the starlight. There was something in his voice, a relief that he tried to hide beneath the practical tone, as if he had been as uncertain about her as she had been about him. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I wasn't sure. Most people choose the devil they know over the one they don't." She reached his side and set down her carpet bag. "I've had enough of devils, known or otherwise." His face showed what might have been a smile, though it was too dark to see clearly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, which he pressed into her hand. "What's this?" "Money. Whatever I've saved over the past 4 years. It's not much, maybe $30, but it's enough to get us started. Food and lodging along the way, and a bit left over for emergencies." The weight of the pouch settled into her palm. $30. Combined with her 8, they had nearly $40 between them. It was not wealth by any measure, but it was more than she had dared to hope for, more than enough to survive if they were careful. "You saved this from Hawthorne's wages?" "What little he paid, yes. I knew I'd need it eventually. I just didn't know when or for what." He took the pouch back and tucked it into his saddlebag. "We'll share the expenses. Partners in this, same as everything else." Partners. The word carried weight she had not expected. She had been so many things in her life: daughter, fiancé, worker, servant, but never a partner. Never an equal. "We need to move," Caleb continued, his practical tone returning. We've got maybe 3 hours before sunrise, and I want to be as far from here as possible by the time Hawthorne wakes up. How far is the Boone Ranch? About 50 miles if we take the direct route. But we can't take the direct route. Hawthorne will figure out where we've gone eventually, and I don't want to make it easy for him to follow. We'll go north first, then cut west through the hills. It'll take longer, but it'll be harder to track. 50 miles. It seemed like an impossible distance, especially for a woman who had spent her life in cities and factories. But Connie had learned, in the months since the fire, that impossible distances could be crossed one step at a time. I'm ready. Caleb helped her mount the mare, adjusting the stirrups to fit her shorter legs. Ever ridden before? Never. Hold the reins loose. Let her follow my horse. She knows what she's doing, even if you don't. It was not the most encouraging of instructions, but Connie appreciated his honesty. She settled into the saddle as best she could, gripping the reins with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to steady them. The mare shifted beneath her, a living creature with its own will and weight, and for a moment she feared she would fall before they had even set off. But the mare seemed to sense her inexperience and stood patiently, waiting for Caleb to mount his own horse and lead the way. "Ready?" he asked. Connie looked back at the dark shape of Hawthorne's ranch house, barely visible against the starlit sky. Somewhere inside, the man who had lured her here with false promises was sleeping soundly, unaware that his servants were escaping into the night. By morning, he would wake to find his housekeeper gone, his ranch hand vanished, his control over them shattered. The thought brought a fierce, unexpected satisfaction. Ready. They set off into the darkness, two shadows moving across the vast Texas plain. The hours before dawn were the hardest. The riding was difficult, especially for someone who had never sat on a horse before. Connie's legs ached from sitting astride the saddle, and her back protested each jolt and sway. The mare was patient, just as Caleb had promised, but patience did not make the journey any more comfortable, and the fear was the worst. Every sound made her flinch. Every distant howl of a coyote sent her heart racing. She kept imagining hoofbeats behind them, imagining Hawthorne discovering their absence and riding in pursuit. She imagined being caught, being dragged back, being punished in ways she could not even name. But the hoofbeats never sounded. The darkness remained empty behind them, and the only sounds were the steady rhythm of their horses and the wind moving across the grass. Caleb rode beside her, close enough to guide her, but not so close as to crowd. He did not speak much, conserving his energy for the journey ahead, but occasionally he would glance back at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Concern, protectiveness. A quiet care that asked nothing in return. She did not know what to make of him, this man who had given up everything to help her escape. He had lost his job, his wages, and his references. He had risked Hawthorne's wrath and whatever legal consequences the rancher might try to impose. He had done all of this for a woman he barely knew, a woman who had nothing to offer him in return. "Why did you do it?" she asked, when the silence became too heavy to bear. "Why did you help me? You could have stayed. You could have kept your head down and waited for a better opportunity." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The horses' hooves created a steady rhythm against the hard ground, filling the silence with their patient labor. "I was 14 when I started working," he said finally. 14 years old, no family, no education, nothing but the clothes on my back and the willingness to do whatever it took to survive. I've spent 14 years since then moving from place to place, working for men who saw me as nothing more than a pair of hands attached to a body. I've been cheated and beaten and treated as if I was less than human." He paused, his eyes fixed on the horizon ahead. "And in all that time, I've watched other people suffer the same way. I've watched women like you arrive at places like Hawthorne's ranch, full of hope, only to have that hope crushed. I've watched them break, one by one, until there was nothing left but the shell of who they used to be. I've watched, and I've done nothing, because doing something would have meant risking what little I had. But you risked it for me." "Yes." His voice was simple, matter of fact. "Because when Hawthorne hit you, something broke in me, something that had been holding for years, keeping me quiet and compliant and safe. I looked at you standing there with your cheek turning red, and I knew I couldn't watch anymore. I couldn't be the man who stood by and did nothing while someone else suffered. The words settled into Connie's chest, warm and unexpected. She had not asked for his sacrifice. She had not expected it, but she understood now, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was what it meant to have an ally. Not someone who protected you because of obligation or expectation, but someone who chose to stand beside you because it was right. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. We're not safe. We won't be safe until we're at the Boone Ranch with jobs and a place to stay. And even then, there's no guarantee Hawthorne won't try to cause trouble. But at least we're trying. At least we're choosing our own path instead of accepting what someone else decided for us." Caleb looked at her, his gray eyes catching the first hint of dawnlight on the horizon. "That's all any of us can do. Choose, and keep choosing, every day until the choices add up to a life worth living." The sun rose as they crested a low ridge, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold, pink, and orange. Connie reined in her horse and stared at the spectacle, momentarily forgetting her exhaustion and her fear in the face of such beauty. The land stretched away in all directions, vast and empty and wild. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, was Hawthorne's ranch and everything she had escaped. Ahead of her was uncertainty, challenge, the unknown landscape of a future she could not predict. But it was her future. That was what mattered. For the first time since the fire, her future belonged to her. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's dangerous," Caleb replied. "Beautiful and dangerous. That's Texas. That's life out here." "Is the Boone Ranch like this? Wide open and vast?" "Similar terrain, but different feeling. Silas Boone runs a tight operation, but he treats his people fairly, pays honest wages, provides decent housing, doesn't work his hands to death or make promises he can't keep." Caleb shifted in his saddle, stretching muscles that must be as tired as hers. "It's not paradise. It's still hard work and long hours and the constant struggle to stay ahead of the weather, cattle prices, and everything else. But it's honest. That's more than most places can claim." Honest. The word sounded almost foreign after the weeks of deception and exploitation she had endured. Honest work, honest wages, honest treatment. It seemed almost too good to be true. And if they won't take us, if there's no work available, or if Hawthorne has already spread word about us, then we keep moving. Find another ranch, another town, another opportunity. The West is full of places that need workers, and don't ask too many questions about where they came from. Caleb's voice was steady, practical. "We'll figure it out, Connie. One step at a time, one day at a time. That's how survival works. One step at a time." She had been living that way for months, and she was tired of it. She wanted stability. She wanted security. She wanted a place to call home and people to call family. But she was learning, slowly and painfully, that those things could not be demanded. They had to be earned. They had to be built, piece by piece, from the fragments of a shattered life. She looked at Caleb, this man who had thrown his lot in with hers, who had chosen her when he could have chosen safety. He was not her husband. He was not her family. He was not anything except an ally, a partner in survival, a fellow traveler on a difficult road. Chapter 10. The Boone Ranch was everything Hawthorne's had not been. Connie saw it first from a distance, after 3 days of hard riding through terrain that had tested every ounce of her endurance. They had followed back trails and dry creek beds, avoiding the main roads where Hawthorne might send men to look for them. They had slept in hollows and under rock overhangs, wrapped in blankets that smelled of horse and dust and freedom. They had rationed their food carefully, making dried beef and hard biscuits last longer than seemed possible. And now, finally, they had arrived. The ranch spread across a wide valley, green with winter grass that the cattle were already grazing. The main house was substantial, built of stone and timber, with a broad porch and real glass windows that caught the afternoon light. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a large barn, a bunkhouse, storage sheds, a smokehouse, all in good repair, all showing the signs of regular maintenance and care. But it was the people who struck Connie most forcefully. Workers moved through the yard with purpose, but without fear. A woman stood on the porch, shading her eyes against the sun, watching their approach with curiosity rather than suspicion. Children played near the barn, their laughter carrying across the open space. It looked like a home. It looked like a community. It looked like all that she had been promised and never received. "That's the Boone place," Caleb said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something else. Relief, perhaps, or hope. "Silas Boone runs a tight operation, but he's fair. His wife Sarah manages the household. She's known for giving people second chances." Connie looked at him, this man who had brought her across 50 miles of wilderness, who had shared his food and his blankets and his carefully hoarded savings. His face was gaunt with fatigue, his clothes dusty and worn, his eyes shadowed from too little sleep. But there was something in his expression she had not seen before, a lightness, an anticipation. "What if they won't take us? Then we keep moving, but I think they will." He urged his horse forward. "Let's find out." Silas Boone was a large man with a weathered face and hands that spoke of decades of physical labor. He listened to Caleb's explanation without interruption, his expression giving nothing away. When Caleb finished, there was a long silence. "Hawthorne," Silas said finally, as if the name left a bad taste in his mouth. "I know of him. Man's got a reputation in this county, and it's not a good one." "We left without his blessing," Caleb admitted. "He'll likely spread word about us, try to make sure we can't find work anywhere." "Let him try." Silas crossed his arms, his jaw set. "I don't put much stock in Edgar Hawthorne's opinions. Never have." He looked at Connie, really looked at her, taking in her exhausted face and travel-worn clothing. "Miss Green, is it? You came west as a mail-order bride?" I answered an advertisement. "Yes. What I found was not what was promised. It rarely is, with men like Hawthorne." Silas's voice was surprisingly gentle. "My wife came west under similar circumstances 20 years ago. Found herself in a bad situation with a man who thought he'd bought himself a servant. She walked 40 miles to get away from him." A smile crossed his weathered face. "I married her 3 months later. Best decision I ever made." Something loosened in her chest, a tension she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. This man understood. He did not judge. He did not condemn her for the desperate choices that had brought her here. "I can work," she said. "I can cook and clean and sew. I'm not afraid of hard labor." "I don't doubt it, but we don't need a housekeeper at the moment. Sarah's got a woman helping her already." Silas stroked his chin thoughtfully. "However, there's a small house on the north side of the property, been sitting empty for a few months now. Used to belong to one of our hands before he moved on. It's not much, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it's solid and it's got a good stove." Caleb straightened. "You'd rent it to us?" "Rent's too strong a word. Call it an arrangement. You work for me, Turner, and the house comes with the job. Fair wages, regular meals, decent hours. Miss Green can stay there too, if she's willing to make herself useful." He looked at Connie again. "Sarah's always looking for help with the mending. The ranch wives, too. They've got more sewing than they can handle. What with all the children and the rough work their men do, you could build up a decent business if you've got the skill." "I have the skill." Connie's voice was steadier now, gaining strength. "I learned from my mother, and I worked in a textile factory before coming west. Then we've got ourselves an arrangement." Silas extended his hand to Caleb, then more formally nodded to Connie. "Welcome to the Boone Ranch. I hope you'll find it more to your liking than your previous situation." A woman appeared on the porch behind Silas, her graying hair pinned back from a face that had once been beautiful and was now merely handsome. Her eyes were sharp and knowing as they moved from Caleb to Connie, taking in their exhausted faces and travel-stained clothing. "Sarah," Silas said, "these are our new arrivals. Turner here will be working with the cattle. Miss Green is a seamstress looking for work." Sarah Boone descended the porch steps and approached Connie directly. Up close, she was smaller than she had appeared from a distance, barely reaching Connie's shoulder, but there was a solidity to her presence that made her seem larger. "You came from Hawthorne's place." It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. I know what that man does. I know what he promises and what he delivers." Sarah's voice was matter of fact, without pity or judgment. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. Come inside. I'll fix you something to eat while Silas shows Turner the house." Connie hesitated, uncertain how to respond to kindness so freely offered. In her experience, generosity always came with conditions, with expectations, with debts that would eventually come due. But Sarah Boone simply waited, her expression patient, as if she had all the time in the world. "Thank you," Connie managed. "That would be welcome." The kitchen in the main house was warm and bright, filled with the smell of bread baking and stew simmering on the stove. Sarah set out plates without ceremony, piling them with food that made Connie's mouth water just from looking at it. Fresh bread, thick stew with vegetables and beef, a slice of pie that glistened with sugar. "Eat," Sarah commanded. "You can tell me your story later if you want. Or not. That's your choice. Your choice." The words settled into Connie's chest like a warm coal. How long had it been since anyone had offered her a choice? She ate without speaking, savoring every bite, feeling strength return to her body with each mouthful. Sarah sat across from her, sipping coffee, asking no questions, demanding no explanations. Simply present, simply welcoming. When Connie's plate was empty, Sarah refilled it without asking, and when that plate was empty too, she simply nodded as if some test had been passed. The house is small, but it's solid. You'll find bedding in the chest at the foot of the bed, and there's a box of kitchen supplies in the cupboard. Plates, cups, a few pots. Nothing fancy, but enough to get you started. She paused, her sharp eyes softening slightly. "And if you need anything else, you come to me. That's not charity. That's how we do things here." The house was small, just as Silas had promised. 2 rooms and a kitchen, with whitewashed walls and wooden floors and windows that let in the winter light. There was a bed in one room, a narrow cot in the other, a stove that heated the whole space when it was properly fed. Someone had left curtains on the windows, faded but still cheerful, printed with small blue flowers. It was the most beautiful place Connie had ever seen. She stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, taking in every detail. The walls were bare but clean. The floor was swept. The stove, when she opened it, was free of ash and ready for use. Someone had cared for this house, had maintained it even when it was empty, had preserved it for whoever might need it next. "It's not much," Caleb said from the doorway, his voice uncertain. "I know you're used to better from before." "I'm used to worse." Connie turned to face him. "Much worse. This is—" She stopped, searching for the word. "This is ours." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them had intended. Ours. As if they were a family. As if they belonged together in this small space, sharing this small life. "I'll take the cot," Caleb said quickly. "The bedroom should be yours." "That seems unfair. You're the one doing the physical labor. And you're the one who needs privacy." His voice was firm but not unkind. "It's decided. Now, I should report to Mr. Boone and find out what he needs me to do. Will you be all right here on your own?" "I've been on my own before." "I know, but you don't have to be anymore." He left before she could respond, his boots echoing on the wooden porch. Connie watched him go, this man who had become her partner through circumstance rather than choice. They were not married. They were not even courting in any proper sense of the word. They were simply 2 people who had decided to face an uncertain future together. It was, she thought, the most honest arrangement she had ever known. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Connie had not experienced since childhood. She rose each morning before dawn, starting the fire in the stove, heating water for washing, and preparing a simple breakfast of porridge or eggs. Caleb would join her in the kitchen, his presence familiar now rather than strange, and they would eat together in companionable silence before he left for his day's work. Then she would begin her own labor. The mending came first, as Silas had predicted. Sarah Boone brought her a basket of torn shirts and worn trousers on the second day, apologizing for the state of them, promising payment as soon as Connie named her price. Within a week, other ranch wives had followed. Mrs. Patterson, with her 5 sons' endless pile of repairs, Mrs. Hernandez, with delicate work that required careful attention, Mrs. O'Brien, with a wedding dress that needed altering for her daughter. The work was steady, but not overwhelming. Connie set her own hours, charged fair prices, and delivered quality results. She earned enough to contribute to the household expenses, enough to set a little aside for emergencies, enough to feel like she was building something rather than merely surviving. And the respect came gradually, earned rather than demanded. The ranch wives treated her as one of their own, inviting her to their quilting circles and their Sunday dinners and their afternoon conversations over coffee and cake. They asked about her journey west, listened to her carefully edited version of events, and offered sympathy and advice in equal measure. They did not pry into her relationship with Caleb, did not demand explanations for the unusual arrangement. They simply accepted her presence as a normal part of their community. It was the first time in her life she had belonged anywhere. The partnership with Caleb deepened through shared routine rather than dramatic revelation. They ate their meals together, discussing the small events of their days. The difficult repair Caleb had managed, the intricate embroidery Connie had completed, the gossip from the ranch wives, the news from town. They divided the household tasks without argument, each taking responsibility for what they did best. He chopped wood and hauled water. She cooked, cleaned, and maintained their small home. It was domestic in a way Connie had never expected to experience. Not the domesticity of the marriage she had been promised to Robert Smith, which would have been formal and distant and defined by obligation. This was warmer, more real. Some evenings, Caleb would bring small gifts from his day: a wildflower he had found growing near the creek, a smooth stone with an unusual pattern. Once, a nest abandoned by its builders, perfectly formed and delicate, which now sat on the windowsill, catching the light. These were not romantic gestures, not in the traditional sense. They were simply tokens of thoughtfulness, evidence that he had been thinking of her, even when they were apart. And Connie found herself reciprocating in her own way. A mended shirt waiting for him when he returned, the tear so carefully repaired it was nearly invisible. A pie made from the last of the apples Sarah had given them. A knitted scarf, worked on during quiet moments, presented without ceremony one morning when the frost was particularly thick. They did not speak of these exchanges. They did not need to. The gifts were a language of their own, saying everything that words could not. She found herself looking forward to evenings, when Caleb would return from the fields and settle into the chair by the stove, his body tired but his spirit content. They would talk for hours sometimes about nothing and everything, about the past and the future and the present moment. She learned his stories of the orphanage, the years of wandering, the gradual hardening that had been softened by kindness received and returned. He learned hers about the factory, the fire, the desperate journey west. They did not hold back. There was no pretense between them, no performance of roles they did not feel. They were simply two people who had found each other in difficult circumstances and chosen to build something together. One evening, as the winter wind howled outside and the stove crackled with warmth, Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending and said, "I never thought I'd have this." "Have what?" "A home, a place to come back to, someone waiting." His gray eyes met hers across the small room. "I spent 14 years telling myself I didn't need any of those, that they were for other people, people with families and money and futures, not for someone like me. And now I'm not so sure." He looked down at the harness in his hands. "Now I'm starting to think maybe everyone deserves a home. Maybe I just never believed I was allowed to have one." Connie set down her sewing and considered her response. The moment was important, weighted with meaning that extended beyond the simple words. "I spent my whole life being told what I would have," she said finally. "What kind of home, what kind of husband, what kind of future. None of it was chosen. All of it was arranged, decided by other people who thought they knew what was best for me." She paused, gathering courage. "This is the first time I've ever chosen for myself, and I chose this. I chose you." The words hung in the air, more intimate than they had ever shared before. Caleb's hands stilled on the harness. His eyes, when he raised them to hers, were bright with something she had not seen before. "I chose you too," he said quietly, "from the moment you refused to break, even when everything was against you. From the moment you stood up to Hawthorne and said no. I knew then that you were different, that you were worth knowing, worth protecting, worth choosing. Yes." His voice was rough. "Worth choosing. They did not touch. They did not cross the careful distance they had maintained for weeks. But there was a shift between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing beneath the surface, nurtured by proximity and respect, and the slow accumulation of shared days. Connie was not owned. She was not promised. She was not used, exploited, or trapped. She was simply present, simply herself, simply a woman who had found her way to a place where her worth was recognized and her choices were honored. And she had chosen Caleb Turner, deliberately, freely, with full knowledge of who he was and what he offered. Not because she had no other options, but because she wanted no other options. Because this man, this life, this small house on the edge of a Texas ranch was all she had never known to hope for. The winter settled in around them, cold and long and beautiful in its starkness. But inside their small home, there was warmth, there was partnership, there was the beginning of what might, with time and care, become love. Connie picked up her sewing and bent over her work, a small smile on her lips. She did not need to rush. She did not need to force. She simply needed to keep choosing, day after day, until the choices added up to a life worth living. And for the first time since the fire, she believed that such a life was possible. Chapter 11. The realization came to Connie on an ordinary morning, while she was kneading bread in the small kitchen of their house. The light was streaming through the windows, catching the flour dust that hung in the air like tiny stars. The stove was warm behind her, heating water for washing. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of the ranch waking up, cattle lowing and men calling to each other across the yard. Inside, there was only the rhythm of her hands against the dough, the creak of the floorboards, the simple peace of a routine task. And she was content. The words surfaced in her mind without warning, unfamiliar and almost startling. Content. She turned it over in her thoughts, examining it from different angles, testing whether it was real or merely a trick of the morning light. When had she last been this way? Before the fire? Before Robert's death? She could not remember. It seemed like her entire life had been spent in states of expectation or fear or endurance, always waiting for something to happen, always bracing for the next disaster. But here, in this small kitchen, with flour on her hands and bread rising under her touch, there was no waiting. There was only this moment, this task, this life she had built with her own choices. She had not noticed the change happening. It had crept up on her like dawn, gradual and inevitable, until suddenly she looked around and found herself in daylight. The constant vigilance that had defined her existence since the fire, the hyper-awareness of threat and opportunity, the exhausting calculation of every interaction and every decision, it had faded without her permission. In its place was something quieter and almost like peace. The bread dough was smooth and elastic under her palms. She shaped it into loaves and set them near the stove to rise, then wiped her hands on her apron and stood by the window, looking out at the land that surrounded their small home. Their home. The phrase still surprised her sometimes. She had never expected to use those words, had never believed she would have a place that belonged to her rather than simply tolerating her presence. But this house, with its 2 rooms and its sturdy stove and its faded curtains printed with blue flowers, this house was hers. Hers and Caleb's. A place they had built together through work and patience and the slow accumulation of shared days. She thought about the woman who had boarded the train in the east, desperate and afraid and certain that hope was a luxury she could not afford. That woman would not recognize her now. That woman had no expectations from life beyond survival. She had believed that happiness only happened to other people, people with families and money and futures that had not been burned to ash. But survival had become something more. Somewhere along the way, without her noticing, endurance had transformed into belonging. Caleb found her still standing by the window when he came in for breakfast. He had been working since before dawn, as he always did, and his clothes bore the evidence of his labor. Dust on his boots, hay clinging to his shirt, the smell of horses and leather, and the honest sweat of physical work. He moved through the small kitchen with the ease of familiarity, washing his hands at the basin, settling into his chair at the table, watching her with those quiet gray eyes that missed nothing. "You're thinking again," he said. "I'm always thinking. More than usual, I mean. You've got that look." He accepted the plate she set before him with a nod of thanks. "Want to share, or would you rather keep it to yourself?" Connie sat across from him, her own plate untouched. "I was thinking about how strange it is to feel safe." Caleb paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Strange? I spent so long expecting the worst, preparing for disaster, counting the days until something went wrong." She shook her head slowly. "But I woke up this morning and realized I wasn't waiting for anything bad to happen. I was just here, living, content." The word hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Caleb set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she was learning to recognize. Tenderness, wrapped in caution, as if he were afraid to want too much. "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "I spent 14 years moving from place to place, never staying long enough to get attached. I told myself it was better that way, easier, that if you have no expectations, you can't be disappointed. And now I have a home, a place to come back to, someone who's waiting for me." His voice roughened slightly. "I never thought I'd have any of those. I never believed I was allowed." "What changed?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window, beyond the ranch, beyond the present moment entirely. When he spoke again, his voice was low and careful, as if speaking the words came at a cost for him. "You changed it. You came into my life, and everything shifted. I watched you survive that which would have broken most people. I watched you refuse to let Hawthorne destroy you. I watched you stand up and say no when saying yes would have been so much easier." He looked at her then, his gray eyes so bright that they made her heart beat faster. "And I thought, if she can be that brave, maybe I can try too. Maybe I can stop running and actually stay somewhere. With someone." Connie's throat tightened. She had heard his admiration before, had witnessed his respect in 100 small gestures and quiet moments. But this was different. This was deeper, more dangerous, and it required her to be brave in return. "I never expected companionship," Caleb continued. "Not really. I expected to work until I couldn't work anymore, and then to die alone somewhere, unmourned and unremembered. That was the future I had planned for myself. It wasn't a good future, but it was the only one I knew how to imagine. And now I can't imagine any future that doesn't have you in it." The confession settled into Connie's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through whatever she had believed about herself and her place in the world. She had been chosen before, by her parents for Robert, by Edgar for his household, always as an object to be assigned rather than a person to be wanted. But Caleb was not choosing her because he needed something from her. He was choosing her because he wanted her specifically, individually, this woman, and no other. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." The afternoon brought sunshine and the first hint of spring warmth after the long winter. Connie took advantage of the weather to hang laundry outside, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions while her mind turned over Caleb's words. She was pinning a shirt to the line when she heard footsteps behind her. Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring house, a basket of her own laundry balanced on her hip, her face creased with the easy smile of someone who had found her place in the world long ago. "Beautiful day for it," Mrs. Patterson said, settling her basket on the ground and beginning to hang her own washing. "Winter was hard this year. I'm glad to see it ending." "As am I." Connie kept her hands moving, grateful for the distraction of simple work. "You've settled in well here. The other women have noticed." Mrs. Patterson's voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp. "They say good things about your mending and about you. I'm grateful for the work. It's more than that, though, isn't it? You've made a home here, a real home, not just a place to stay." Mrs. Patterson paused in her hanging, studying Connie with an expression that combined curiosity and approval. "Mr. Turner, too. The men say he's changed since you arrived, more settled, more content." The word again, content. It kept appearing, like a theme in a piece of music, repeating and building until it could no longer be ignored. "We're partners," Connie said carefully. "We help each other." "Partners." Mrs. Patterson smiled, the kind of smile that said she understood more than Connie was willing to admit. "That's a good word for it. Better than most marriages start with, honestly. Plenty of couples spend their whole lives without ever becoming partners. We're not married. Not yet. The words were said lightly, without pressure or judgment. But you could be, if you wanted. There's nothing stopping you except yourselves. Connie found her hands had stilled on the clothespin she was holding. It's not that simple. Why not? Mrs. Patterson's voice held genuine curiosity rather than challenge. You already share a home. You already share your days. From what I can see, you've already built a life together. Marriage would just be putting a name on what already exists. Marriage has a different meaning for me. Connie forced her hands back into motion, pinning the shirt to the line. Where I come from, marriage was an arrangement that families decided. That happened to you. It was not for you to choose. And where you are now? The question hung in the air, simple and profound. Where was she now? She was not in the East anymore, bound by the expectations of families and social position. She was not at Hawthorne's ranch, trapped by false promises and exploitation. She was here, on the Boone property, in a community that had accepted her without demanding explanations or imposing conditions. I suppose it is different here, she admitted. It can be. Mrs. Patterson finished hanging her last piece and straightened, her basket empty on the ground beside her. My mother married for duty. My grandmother married for survival. But I chose my husband because I wanted to spend my life with him, and 30 years later, I've never regretted that choice. She paused, her weathered face softening with memory. Out here, we get to make our own rules. That's what the frontier is for, starting over, choosing differently. Mrs. Patterson gathered her empty basket and walked away, leaving Connie alone with the laundry and the sunshine and the weight of words she had not been prepared to hear. That evening, after supper, after the dishes, after the small domestic rituals that had become the framework of their shared life, Connie and Caleb sat together on the small porch of their house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the first stars were beginning to emerge in the deepening blue. They had sat here many times before, in comfortable silence or in quiet conversation, watching the day end and the night begin. But tonight was different. Tonight, the air between them was charged with unspoken words, with the weight of feelings that had been acknowledged but not yet resolved. I talked to Mrs. Patterson today, Connie said finally. About what? About us, about what we are to each other. She kept her eyes on the horizon, not quite ready to look at him directly. She called us partners. She said it was better than most marriages start with. Caleb was quiet for a moment. She's probably right. She also said there was nothing stopping us from getting married, if we wanted. The silence stretched between them, full of possibility and fear in equal measure. Connie's heart was pounding, though she kept her expression calm. She had learned to hide her feelings during the months of hardship and survival, to present a composed face to the world regardless of what churned beneath. But hiding was wrong now, with this man, in this moment. Do you want that? Caleb asked. His voice was careful, stripped of any emotion that might influence her answer. Marriage? I don't know. The honesty surprised her. I've been so focused on surviving, on building something stable, that I haven't let myself think about what comes next. Marriage always seemed like something that happened to me, not something I chose. It doesn't have to be that way. Caleb turned to face her, his gray eyes steady in the fading light. Nothing between us has to be the way it was before. Not for you and not for me. What do you mean? I mean that whatever we become, whatever we choose to be, it will be your choice as much as mine. I won't push you. I won't pressure you. I won't assume that because we share this house, because we've built this life together, that you owe me any more than what you freely want to give. The words settled into her heart like rain into dry earth, nourishing what had been withered for too long. She'd had promises made to her before. She had been told what her future would hold, what her role would be, what she could expect from the arrangement others had made on her behalf. But this was different. This was an offer, not a demand, a possibility, not an obligation. You would wait, she tested slowly. You would let me decide, even if it took months, even if I never decided at all. Yes, why? Because you deserve to choose your own future. because I would rather have you as a partner who stays by choice than as a wife who stays through obligation. Because I love you, and loving someone means wanting their happiness even more than your own. The words I love you struck her like lightning, illuminating everything in a single brilliant flash. She had suspected, she had hoped, in the quiet parts of her heart she rarely visited. But hearing it spoken aloud, plainly and without qualification, transformed suspicion into certainty. You love me, she repeated. I do. I have for longer than I knew how to admit, even to myself. His voice was rough with emotion. But loving you doesn't give me any claim on you. It doesn't make you mine or make me entitled to your affection. It just means I want the best for you, whatever that looks like. Connie turned to face him fully, taking in his weathered face and his quiet eyes and the hands that had worked so hard to build this life they shared. She thought about everything they had survived together: the escape from Hawthorne's ranch, the journey through the wilderness, the slow, careful construction of a home from nothing but determination and trust. She thought about the woman she had been, the woman who had accepted the future others chose for her because she believed she had no power to choose differently. That woman was gone now. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned through hardship that choice was always possible, even when every option seemed impossible. And she chose Caleb Turner, not because she had no other options, not because he could provide security or stability or protection from a hostile world. She chose him because she wanted him, because his steadiness calmed her fears, because his kindness healed her wounds, because his presence made even the hardest days bearable and the best days beautiful. I love you too, she said. The words came out quietly, but clearly, and they changed everything. Caleb's expression shifted, surprise and joy and relief mingling in a way that made him look younger, softer, more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with a gentleness that belied their strength. You don't have to decide anything tonight, he said, about marriage, about the future, about any of it. We have time. We have all the time we need. I know. Connie squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers, the solid reality of his presence beside her. But I've already made a decision. I've decided that whatever comes next, I want it to include you. Whatever shape our future takes, I want to choose it together. Together, Caleb repeated, and the words sounded like a promise. They sat on the porch as the stars emerged overhead, their hands intertwined, the warmth between them a contrast to the cooling evening air. Connie leaned slightly into his shoulder, allowing herself the small intimacy, and he shifted to accommodate her weight. It was such a simple act, such a small gesture, but it meant the world. The night sounds surrounded them, crickets beginning their chorus, a distant owl calling from somewhere in the darkness, the soft lowing of cattle settling for the night. These were the sounds of their life now, the soundtrack to a future neither of them had imagined, but both had chosen. What happens now? She asked quietly. Whatever we decide. Caleb's voice was steady, certain. We could court properly if you want. Take our time. Let our relationship develop the way it's supposed to. And if I said I wanted that, a real courtship with all the proper steps, then that's what we'll do. He squeezed her hand gently. I told you, Connie, your choice. Always your choice. She smiled into the darkness, the truth of his words warm in her heart. This was what love could be. Not a cage, not an obligation, not a transaction between families or a desperate bid for survival. Love could be this: quiet, steady, built on respect and trust and the simple joy of being together. Winter was ending. Spring was coming, and for the first time in her life, Connie Green looked forward to tomorrow, not with fear or resignation, but with hope. Hope that was chosen, hope that was earned, hope that belonged to her alone. Chapter 12. The conversation began at breakfast, over eggs and fresh bread and the strong coffee Connie had learned to brew the way Caleb liked it. We should talk about what this means, she said, setting her cup down and meeting his eyes directly. About what happens next, practically. Caleb nodded, his expression serious. He had been expecting this, she could tell. He had been waiting for her to be ready, letting her set the pace just as he had promised. What do you want to know? Everything. I want to know how you see our future, what marriage means to you, what you expect from a wife, and what I should expect from a husband." She kept her voice steady, though her heart was beating faster than she would have liked. "I've been part of arrangements before. I know how they work, but I've never been part of one where I had any say in the terms." "Then let's talk about terms." Caleb pushed his plate aside and leaned forward, giving her his full attention. "What matters most to you?" "Equality." The word came out without hesitation. "I don't want to be owned. I don't want to be controlled. I want a partnership where my voice matters as much as yours, where my work is valued as much as yours, where I have the right to make decisions about my own life. That's what I want too." His voice was quiet but firm. "I've worked for men who treated their wives like property. I've seen what happens in those households. I have no interest in that kind of marriage." "And money? How would that work?" "Shared. What I earn belongs to both of us. What you earn belongs to both of us. We make decisions together about how to spend it, how to save it, what to invest in, and what to let go." He paused, considering. "Unless you'd rather keep your earnings separate, that's your choice too." "I'd rather share." The answer surprised her, but it was right. "I've been alone too long. I'm tired of keeping it all to myself, protecting everything by myself. I want a partner who carries the weight with me." "Then that's what you'll have." They talked for an hour, maybe longer, working through the practical details of what their life together would look like, where they would live, a question with an obvious answer, since they were already in this small house they had made into a home. How they would divide the work, with Caleb continuing his ranch labor and Connie continuing her sewing and mending. What they would do if they were blessed with children of their own, a topic that made both of them blush slightly but needed to be addressed nonetheless. By the time the coffee pot was empty and the morning light had shifted from gold to white, they had sketched the outline of a life. Not perfect, not complete, but honest, built on conversation rather than assumption, founded on respect rather than obligation. "There's one more thing," Connie said, as Caleb was preparing to leave for his day's work. "What's that?" "I want a proper courtship." She held up her hand to forestall his response. "I know we already live together. I know we've already said we love each other. But I've never had someone court me. I've never had someone choose to pursue me, to make the effort, to show through their actions that I'm worth winning. I want that. Even if it seems silly, given all that we've already shared." Caleb's expression softened. "It doesn't seem silly. It seems exactly right." He reached for his hat, then paused at the door. "How long should this courtship last?" "A month, maybe 2. She smiled slightly. "Long enough for us to be sure. Long enough for it to feel real." "A month, then, or 2. He returned her smile, and there was warmth in it that made her heart lift. "I'll do my best to be worth the wait." The courtship that followed was unlike anything Connie had ever experienced. It began with small gestures. Wildflowers left on the kitchen table when she woke in the morning, a book of poetry borrowed from Sarah Boone and presented shyly, as if Caleb was not entirely sure it was the right gift. A carved wooden bird, no bigger than her palm, that he had worked on during quiet evenings while she was occupied with her sewing. But the gestures grew. Caleb took her for walks in the evenings, when his work was done, and the air was cooling, showing her the land he had come to know during his months of labor. He pointed out the best swimming hole in the creek, the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring, the ridge from which you could see for miles in every direction. He shared the landscape with her as if it were a secret, as if by showing her these places, he was inviting her into a part of himself he kept hidden from others. And he talked, more than he ever had before, opening himself to her in ways that required courage and trust. He told her about the orphanage, about the cold beds and the inadequate food, and the endless work that was supposed to build character, but mostly built resentment. He told her about the years of wandering, the ranches where he had worked, and the men he had worked for, the gradual erosion of hope that had left him expecting nothing from life except survival. "I thought I was broken," he said one evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge. "I thought whatever part of a person is supposed to feel love and connection had been damaged beyond repair. I moved through the world without really being part of it, doing my work, keeping my head down, waiting for life to be over. And now I know I was wrong. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft in the gathering darkness. You showed me I was wrong, not by fixing me. You can't fix what isn't broken, but by showing me that connection was possible, that I was capable of it, even after everything. That love wasn't reserved for other people, people who had grown up with families and security and all the things I never had. Connie reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You deserved love all along. You just needed someone to help you see it. I needed you. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything in his heart. Specifically, you. Not just anyone. You. A week into the courtship, Caleb asked Connie's permission to speak with Silas Boone. I want to do this properly, he explained. You don't have a father I can ask, but Silas has become a little like that to both of us. He took us in when we had nowhere to go. He gave us this chance to start over. It seems right to include him in this decision. Connie agreed, touched by Caleb's thoughtfulness. She watched from the kitchen window as he walked toward the main house, his steps careful and deliberate, his hat in his hands. The conversation took longer than she expected. Nearly an hour passed before Caleb emerged from the Boone house, his expression unreadable from this distance. He walked back toward their small home, and Connie forced herself to remain calm, to wait for him to come inside rather than rushing out to meet him. Well, she asked when he finally stepped through the door. He gave his blessing. Caleb's face broke into a smile, genuine and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen. More than that, he offered me a promotion, foreman once the current one retires in the spring, better wages, a larger house if we want it. And you accepted? I told him I needed to discuss it with you first. He set his hat on the hook by the door and turned to face her fully. I meant what I said about partnership, Connie, about making decisions together. This affects both of us. It should be our choice, not just mine. The words settled into her heart like sunshine. This was what she had hoped for. This was what she had dared to believe might be possible. A man who valued her opinion, who included her in decisions, who treated their life together as a shared enterprise rather than his domain to rule. What do you want? She asked. I want whatever makes you happy. He paused, then corrected himself. No, that's not quite right. I want us both to be happy. I want a life we build together that reflects both our dreams. If you want to stay in this small house, we stay. If you want the larger one, we move. Either way, we're together. I think, Connie said slowly, that a larger house might be nice, someday, when we have children to fill it. The words hung between them, full of promise and possibility. Children, a family, a future that extended beyond survival into something that looked remarkably like joy. Then that's what we'll work toward. Caleb crossed the room and took her hands in his. Together. The guidance came from Sarah Boone, offered during one of their afternoon visits when Connie brought finished mending to the main house. Sit down, Sarah said, gesturing to the chair across from her at the kitchen table. I want to talk to you about marriage. Connie sat, her hands folded in her lap, uncertain what to expect. Sarah had been kind to her from the beginning, welcoming and supportive without being intrusive. But this was different, more intentional. I know you came west as a mail-order bride, Sarah began. I know the result didn't work out the way you expected, and I know you're preparing to marry Caleb now under very different circumstances. She paused, her sharp eyes studying Connie's face. Do you love him? Yes. Does he love you? Yes. Good, that's the foundation. But love isn't enough to make a marriage work. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. I've been married to Silas for 25 years. I love him, and he loves me. But we've had to work at our marriage every single day, negotiating and compromising and finding ways to be partners even when we disagreed. How do you do that? By remembering that marriage doesn't erase who you are. You don't become less of yourself when you become someone's wife. Your opinions still matter. Your dreams still matter. Your voice still matters. Sarah's voice grew fierce. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Not Caleb, not the other ranch wives, not society or tradition or anything else. You have the right to be yourself within your marriage, to maintain your own identity, to keep the parts of yourself that make you who you are. Caleb says he wants that too, a partnership of equals. Then hold him to it. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Connie's hand. Men mean well, most of them, but they've been raised to have certain expectations of wives, to expect certain behaviors and patterns that they might not even realize they're expecting. When those expectations conflict with the partnership you've agreed to, speak up. Remind him. Don't let convenience or habit or the path of least resistance erode the equality you've worked so hard to establish. And if he resists, then you work it out together, as partners should. Talk about it. Argue about it if you have to. But never let disagreement become domination. Never let his voice drown out yours. Sarah released her hand and sat back. The best marriages I've seen are the ones where both people keep growing, keep changing, keep becoming more fully themselves. Don't sacrifice your growth for his comfort, and don't let him sacrifice his for yours either. Connie absorbed the words, feeling their weight and their wisdom. This was what she needed. Not rules or instructions, but guidance. A framework for building the kind of marriage she wanted, the kind of partnership she had dreamed of, without knowing how to articulate it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're welcome." Sarah smiled, the fierce expression softening into warmth. "Now, tell me about this courtship of yours. I hear Caleb's been leaving flowers on your table." The proposal came on a Sunday afternoon, 6 weeks after their conversation about terms. They had walked to the ridge Caleb loved, the one with the view that stretched for miles, and they sat together on a flat rock, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. The land spread out below them, green and gold and endless, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the ranch buildings tiny shapes against the vast landscape. "I have something for you," Caleb said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, worn at the edges, clearly old. When he opened it, Connie saw a ring, a simple gold band with a small stone that caught the light like captured starlight. "It belonged to my mother," he said quietly. "It's all I have of hers. The orphanage let me keep it, probably because it wasn't worth much money, but it was worth the world to me." He paused, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you to have it. I want you to wear it, if you'll have me." Connie looked at the ring, at this small piece of his history that he was offering to her. She thought about all they had survived together, all they had built, all they had chosen. She thought about the woman she had been when she boarded that train, desperate and afraid and certain that love only happened to other people. She was no longer that woman. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned that choice was always possible, even when every option seemed impossible. And she chose Caleb Turner. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." The words came out clear and strong, without hesitation or reservation. This was not an arrangement made by others on her behalf. This was not a desperate bid for survival or security. This was a choice, freely made by a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and had found the courage to claim it. Caleb's face transformed with joy, with relief, with love so clear and present that it took her breath away. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly despite the steadiness of his voice, and it fit as if it had been made for her. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." They sat together on that ridge as the sun set and the stars emerged, their hands intertwined, their futures woven together. Behind them lay the path that had brought them here, full of hardship and loss, and the slow, painful process of learning to trust again. Ahead of them lay the life they would build together, day by day, choice by choice, two people who had found in each other all they had never dared to hope for. Connie looked at the ring on her finger, this small circle of gold that meant everything and nothing. It was just a symbol, after all. The reality was in the man beside her, in the life they shared, in the future they would create together. But symbols mattered. This ring said she belonged somewhere. This ring said she had been chosen, not as property or obligation, but as a partner. This ring said that love was possible, even for people who had lost everything, even for people who had stopped believing. "When should we marry?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready." Caleb's voice was warm against the cooling evening air. "We have all the time in the world." "Spring," she decided. "When the wildflowers bloom. I want to remember this place the way it looks in spring. Spring it is. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body against hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing. This was what she had traveled 1,000 miles to find, although she had not known it at the time. This was what she had survived the fire, the factory, and the exploitation to reach. Not a destination on a map. Not a promise made by a stranger in a newspaper advertisement, but this man, this moment, this choice that was entirely her own. They stayed on the ridge until the stars filled the sky, talking about the future they would build and the life they would share. They talked about the wedding Sarah Boone had already offered to help plan. They talked about the spring garden Connie wanted to plant, with vegetables, herbs, and flowers to brighten their small home. They talked about the children they hoped to have someday, the family they would build together, the legacy of love and choice they would pass down to the next generation. The wind was cool, but not cold, carrying the scent of grass and cattle and the promise of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered, voices crying out across the wilderness. But Connie was not alone anymore. She would never be alone again. She thought about the woman who had boarded that westbound train, desperate and afraid, and certain that hope was a luxury she could not afford. That woman would hardly recognize her now. The woman who had believed that love happened to other people, and that happiness was reserved for those who had not lost everything, and that the best she could hope for was survival, had learnt how survival had become something more. Endurance had transformed into belonging. Fear had given way to faith, not in the world or in fate, but in herself and in the man beside her. She had found her home. She had found her partner. She had found the love she had stopped believing in, and she had chosen it. Every step of the way, she had chosen it. That was what made it real. That was what made it lasting. That was what made it hers.